Have you ever wondered what you would do if life left you standing at a closed gate with nowhere to go and no one waiting on the other side on the Dakota frontier? A young woman arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a promise only to be abandoned before she could take her first step into her new life. But when a quiet cowboy saw her standing alone in the wind, he faced a choice that would change everything. Should he keep his distance or offer shelter to a stranger who carried more sorrow than hope? What would you have done in a land where kindness could mean survival? One man's decision to open his door led to the kind of love no one believed could grow from heartbreak. From that single act of compassion came a home, a family, and a legacy that would outlive them both. Would you have had the courage to stop, to help, to love? Stay with us as we step back in time to the heart of the frontier, where every sunset carried a second chance. Like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, and let this story remind you that even the hardest roads can lead home. The wedding dress lay crumpled in the Dakota dust as Clara Whitfield stood alone at the gate of Iron Creek Ranch. A scrap of paper trembled in her gloved hand. Its words, cutting deeper than any blade, changed my mind. Don't come looking. The stagecoach that had carried her across 1,000 miles of prairie was already gone, a fading speck swallowed by the August horizon. The air shimmered with heat. Locusts hummed. The vast silence pressed down until it seemed even God had turned away. Clara's heart hammered inside her corseted bodice. She had left Philadelphia with little more than courage and a train ticket, trading lace parlors and cobblestone streets for a chance at a home, maybe even love. For 3 months, she had written letters to a man who promised safety, partnership, and respect. His name had been Thomas Henderson, a respectable rancher who claimed he needed a wife strong enough for frontier life. She had believed every word. Now, all that remained was dust and humiliation. Her legs trembled beneath the heavy skirts, but she refused to sit on her trunk like some abandoned parcel. She was 26 years old, too proud to beg, too stubborn to cry. After her father's death left her penniless, she'd poured her last savings into this journey west, chasing a dream that evaporated before her eyes. She read the note again, even though she already knew every cruel syllable. Miss Whitfield changed my mind. The arrangement is off. Don't come looking. Signed with a flourish that mocked her faith in decency. A sound broke through the stillness, the rhythmic thunder of hooves drawing closer. She straightened instinctively, smoothing her travel-worn dress. Maybe Henderson had come to explain himself, to undo this nightmare. But the man who reined in his horse was no Henderson. He sat tall in the saddle, lean and broad-shouldered, his face carved by wind and work. Sunlight caught in the faint streaks of silver at his temples. His eyes, gray-blue like a coming storm, studied her quietly. "Ma'am," he said, tipping a weather-beaten Stetson. His voice was deep and unhurried, roughened by years of disuse. "You lost." Clara lifted her chin, clinging to her dignity like armor. "No, sir. I'm exactly where I was meant to be. It's Mr. Henderson who seems to have lost his way." The stranger's gaze drifted to the letter in her hand, then to the trunk-marked Philadelphia Railway Co. Understanding darkened his expression. "You're the bride from back east. I was supposed to be," she answered, forcing her tone steady though humiliation burned her throat. "Mr. Henderson appears to have changed his mind. That yellow-bellied fool," the man muttered, then stopped himself. "Beg pardon, ma'am." Henderson's been my neighbor 5 years, but this ain't right." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. Tears stung, but she blinked them away. She would not cry in front of a stranger. "If you could direct me to the nearest town," she said softly, "I'll find lodging and work." He swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, moving with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. Up close, Clara saw that the weather had not hardened his eyes. They carried something gentler loneliness, maybe, or memory. "Town's 15 miles east," he said. "If you'll pardon me saying, there's not much there for a lady alone, only rooms above the saloon, and the kind of work that'd break a decent heart." "I see," she murmured. "Then I'll simply have to make do." "With what money?" he asked, not unkindly. "Did Henderson send you travel funds for the return trip?" Her silence was answer enough. He removed his hat, ran a rough hand through his dark silver hair, and exhaled slowly. "Name's Eli Dawson," he said. "My place is just over that ridge, nothing fancy, but it's clean and honest. I could use some help keeping the house in order." He met her eyes squarely. "Room, board, and proper wages. Nothing untoward, you have my word." Clara studied him carefully. His shirt was patched but neat, his boots scuffed yet cared for. His hands bore the calluses of labor, his face the plain decency of a man who meant what he said, and still, trust did not come easily. "Why," she asked quietly, "why would you help me?" Eli replaced his hat, gaze drifting toward the abandoned ranch on the horizon. "Because a man who leaves a woman standing at his gate ain't worth the dust on his boots," he said. "Because you came all this way on a promise, and someone ought to keep at least a piece of it. And because—" He paused, the words rough in his throat. "I know what it's like to be alone when you counted on not being." The wind rose again, swirling grit around them. Clara's skirt whipped against her legs. Her bonnet ribbons snapped like flags. She thought of her options, the saloon upstairs rooms, the long road back east, or this stranger whose eyes held both sadness and honor. "I don't even know you," she said. "No, ma'am." "You don't?" he answered gently. "But you didn't know Henderson either, did you? He had her there. I'll make you a deal." Eli continued. "Come to my place, get a hot meal, rest for the night. Tomorrow, if you still want to head to town, I'll hitch the wagon and take you myself. I'll even pay for a week's lodging while you figure things out." Clara looked toward the empty ranch once more, the gate swinging lazily in the wind, the dust settling where her future was supposed to begin. She straightened her shoulders. "Very well, Mr. Dawson," she said at last. "I accept for tonight." He nodded once, a glimmer of relief passing through his eyes. "Then let's get you out of this sun, Miss Whitfield." He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing and secured it behind his saddle. When he offered his hand to help her mount, she hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her gloved fingers in his. His grip was firm, steady, reassuring. They rode west toward the line of cottonwoods marking Iron Creek, the evening light spilling gold across the prairie. Behind them, the abandoned ranch faded into the distance until it was nothing but shadow and memory. Ahead lay a ridge, a stranger's home, and perhaps the first spark of something neither dared to name. "At least tonight, you'll have a decent meal and a clean bed," Eli said quietly. Clara glanced toward the distant outline of Henderson's ranch. Even in daylight, the place seemed cold and lifeless, as though the soil itself had rejected her. Then she looked at the man beside her, broad-shouldered, calm, waiting for her answer with the kind of patient respect she hadn't expected to find in the middle of nowhere. "I accept your offer, Mr. Dawson," she said. "For tonight?" He nodded once and moved to lift her trunk. It looked impossibly heavy, but he hefted it as if it were filled with feathers. "Let me tie this to my horse," he said, looping the rope with practiced efficiency. Then he turned to her. "Can you ride? I've ridden," Clara replied, though truthfully her experience had been limited to polite Sunday outings on quiet carriage horses in the city parks of Philadelphia. "Good," he said simply. He tightened the straps, then swung back into the saddle. "You can ride with me or walk, your choice." She looked down at her boots, dust already coating the thin leather. The thought of walking 15 miles in her traveling dress was unbearable. Riding with a stranger was hardly proper, but propriety seemed a luxury she could no longer afford. She drew in a breath. "I'll ride." Eli reached down a calloused hand. His grip was steady and warm as he helped her up, seating her side saddle in front of him with careful distance. He adjusted her skirts so they fell modestly and nodded toward the trail. "Hold the saddle horn." "Ma'am." "Zeus is a gentle horse, but the path's rough in places." As they started toward the ridge, Clara couldn't help glancing back one last time. The gate to Henderson's ranch stood ajar, creaking faintly in the wind like a sneer. Her foolish dreams lingered there in the dust. "Don't look back, Miss Whitfield," Eli said softly behind her. "Nothing good ever comes from looking back." The words struck deeper than he could have known. She faced forward again, the rhythm of the horse's gait steady beneath her. They rode in silence for a time, the prairie stretching endless in gold around them. The land shifted as they traveled flat fields giving way to low rolling hills dotted with pine and cottonwood. Eli pointed out the landmarks as they passed. "That's Miller's Creek," he said, gesturing to a thin ribbon of water glinting in the sun. "Runs cold year-round. Good for washing and for trout if you're lucky." Farther along, he nodded toward a massive rock formation rising from the earth like a fortress. "Eagle's Rest," he explained. "You can see clear to Redstone from the top." She listened quietly, half to his voice and half to the wind moving through the grass. When he spoke again, his tone was easy, but she sensed the pride behind it. "The boundary fence ahead marks my land. Built it myself that first year." "How much land do you have?" she asked, more to fill the silence than from any real need to know. 640 acres, he said. "Not as big as Henderson's spread he's got near 2,000, but mine's paid for. No debt, no liens. Built the house and barn with my own hands." "Where were you before?" she asked gently. "Virginia," he said, voice tightening just slightly. "Then the war came, and afterward, well, heading west felt like the only thing that made sense." Clara didn't press. She'd been a girl when the war ended. But she remembered the hollow-eyed veterans who had wandered through Philadelphia. Her own father had lost everything when his supply contracts with the Union were cut off. The war might have ended, but it had taken more than lives. It had stolen futures. Eli glanced down at her, curiosity softening his features. "What about you, Miss Whitfield? What brings a lady from Philadelphia to the edge of nowhere?" "Desperation," she admitted. "My father died 6 months ago. Debts took everything, the house, the business, even the furniture. I worked in a textile factory for a while, 12 hours a day for barely enough to eat. Then I saw Mr. Henderson's advertisement." She gave a small, rueful smile. It seemed like a chance at something better. Eli nodded thoughtfully. Factory work, then? That why your hands are like that? Clara blinked, surprised he'd noticed. She wore gloves, but his eyes missed little. The calluses, the faint scars from needles and machines, marks she'd tried to hide. You're observant, she said. Have to be, he answered. Out here, what you don't notice can kill you. His tone softened. Those hands tell me you're not afraid of work. That's a good thing. Life here's not kind to the idle. They crested the final hill, and Iron Creek Ranch came into view. It was smaller than she had imagined, but tidy and well kept. A single-story log house with a proper shingle roof sat nestled between stands of cottonwood. A red barn gleamed nearby, its fence enclosing several horses. Rows of beans and corn struggled against the summer heat, and a chicken coop bustled with life. A well and hand pump stood near the porch, and behind it, a small root cellar half buried in the earth. It's beautiful, Clara said honestly. You built all this yourself? Mostly, Eli replied. The neighbors helped with the barn raising. Out here, we help each other when we can. His tone darkened just a touch. Most of us, anyway. He dismounted and reached for her. His hands steadied her waist as he helped her down, then dropped away almost instantly, as if even that brief touch had been too intimate. I'll show you inside. The house smelled faintly of pine smoke and soap. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, dominated by a wide stone hearth. A table and 4 chairs occupied the center. Shelves of simple dishes lined the wall, and a single rocking chair sat by the window, the only piece that looked like it had come from a store. There are 2 bedrooms, Eli said, pointing down a short hallway. You can take the larger one. I'll move to the smaller. I couldn't, she protested. You can, and you will, he said firmly. You're a guest, and you'll be comfortable. I'll bring your trunk in. While he was outside, Clara wandered through the rooms. The larger bedroom held a proper bed covered with a hand-stitched quilt, a dresser with a cloudy mirror, and another rocking chair. The smaller room contained only a cot and a narrow shelf. She wondered if he had built the larger one for a wife he never found. Then decided some questions were best left unasked. The kitchen shelves held the staples of a bachelor's diet: flour, beans, dried meat, a few jars of preserves, but no vegetables or fruit. The garden she'd seen outside made sense now. When Eli returned carrying her trunk, she turned from the window. For the first time since stepping off that doomed stagecoach, she felt something stir inside her, a faint flicker of safety, maybe even the beginning of belonging. Eli had tried to grow vegetables, but the garden told the story of a man who knew more about horses and fences than soil and seed. Dry earth cracked around wilted stalks, and weeds claimed what the summer sun hadn't already beaten down. I usually just fry up some bacon and beans, Eli said from the doorway, his voice startling her. Clara turned quickly, one hand still resting on the pantry shelf. He'd set her trunk in the bedroom and now stood watching her inspect his supplies. There's eggs, too. Chickens keep me fed, more or less. I can cook, she offered, uncertain but sincere. If you'd like, as a thank you. I'd appreciate that, he said after a pause. Been living on my own cooking 3 years now. A man gets tired of his own mistakes. Clara found an apron hanging by the door and tied it around her waist. The simple motion stirred something unexpected, a faint ache of familiarity. It felt like stepping into a life she didn't recognize but somehow belonged to. She began to move with quiet purpose, checking what little there was and piecing together a meal from odds and ends. She made biscuits from memory, her mother's recipe the kind you didn't measure, only felt. While they baked, she fried bacon until crisp, then used the grease to brown potatoes and onions she'd found in the cellar. The eggs she whisked with a splash of cream, adding salt, pepper, and a pinch of paprika discovered in the back of a dusty shelf. As the scents filled the cabin, the air seemed to soften. Eli leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, saying little but watching her with a kind of quiet awe. When she finally set the table forks on the left, knives on the right, mismatched though they were, his face was unreadable. "This is too much trouble," he murmured. "Nonsense," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "Sit down before it gets cold." They ate in silence at first, but it wasn't awkward. Clara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite melted on her tongue. The simple food tasted like comfort, like something that could hold the world together if only for one evening. Eli ate the way a man works, steady, measured, without indulgence. Halfway through the meal, he looked up and said softly, "This is good, real good. Haven't had biscuits like these since." He trailed off, eyes fixed on the plate. "Since my mother passed, before the war." Clara wanted to ask more, but instinct told her not to push. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was respectful, shared between two people with ghosts of their own. She reached for her glass. "Your garden could do better if you water it in the evenings and pack the soil with straw to keep in the moisture. The tomatoes could use stakes for support." Eli looked at her with mild surprise. "You know about gardening. My mother kept one," she said, smiling faintly. "I helped her since I was old enough to walk. She believed the earth could heal almost anything if you were patient enough." "She was right," he said quietly. "She died when I was 16, Clara added, her voice steady. "Consumption." He nodded. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." When she stood to gather the dishes, Eli stopped her with a raised hand. "You cooked. I'll clean. That's fair." She hesitated, then smiled a little as she watched him work this rough-edged cowboy, carefully washing each plate, drying them with a clean cloth as if they were the finest china. The rhythm of it soothed her more than she expected. Thomas Henderson's letters had been full of wealth and pride, all talk of comfort and fine living. But looking at Eli Dawson bent over the sink, sleeves rolled, back straight, she realized what those letters had never mentioned: decency. By the time the dishes were done, the sun had slipped low, the horizon flamed with color, orange melting into violet. Clara stepped out onto the porch, settling into the rocking chair while Eli saw to the horses. The sound of his voice drifted through the dusk, low and calm as he spoke to the animals. There was tenderness in it, the kind that came from understanding rather than ownership. When he joined her, night had fallen. He sat on the steps instead of the empty chair beside her. "You decided what you'll do tomorrow?" he asked. She had been thinking about little else. "Your offer room, board, and wages for household help. Was that genuine, every word?" he said simply. "For how long? As long as you need," he answered. "Or until you find something better?" She studied his profile in the fading light. "And you expect nothing else? No additional duties?" Eli turned his head, meeting her eyes squarely. "Miss Whitfield, I'm not Thomas Henderson. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep, and I don't take what isn't freely given. You'd be my housekeeper, nothing more, unless you chose otherwise. And if that day ever came, it wouldn't be out of obligation or fear. It'd be because you wanted it." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. No man had ever spoken to her that way, not with pity, not with hunger, but with plain, quiet respect. "Yes," she said softly. "That's clear. Good," he said. "Then, what's your decision?" She looked out at the dark expanse of land stretching beyond the porch. It was wild and unfamiliar, but honest in a way the city never had been. In Philadelphia, she'd been surrounded by people and yet felt invisible. Here, beside this taciturn stranger, she felt seen. "I'll stay," she said. "For now. We'll see how it goes." Eli rose, brushing the dust from his hands. "Fair enough. I'm up at dawn to tend the stock. Sleep as late as you need. You've had a long journey." "I'm used to rising early," she replied. He smiled faintly. "Then I'll see you at breakfast, at the doorway." He paused. "Miss Whitfield, I'm sorry about Henderson. Man's a fool." After he went inside, Clara remained on the porch, rocking slowly as the night sounds rose around her. Coyotes called in the distance, the windmill creaked, and the soft rush of Iron Creek whispered somewhere beyond the trees. Only 24 hours earlier, she'd been on a train full of hopes and plans for a future that had vanished like steam on the tracks. Now she sat on a stranger's porch, her life turned upside down. And yet, for the first time in months, she didn't feel lost. She looked up at the Dakota sky, stars sharp and endless. Maybe dreams that came too easily weren't the ones worth keeping. Maybe the things that lasted were the ones you built with your own hands, piece by piece, day by day, inside. She could hear Eli moving around, the quiet shuffle of a man settling into the rituals of night. Tomorrow she would learn his ways, adapt to his rhythm, and carve out a small corner of belonging in this new life. It wasn't the future she'd imagined, but perhaps, she thought, that was the very thing that made it real. All night. Clara had turned over questions that had no answers. Had Thomas Henderson seen her from afar and decided she wasn't what he'd imagined? Had some other woman caught his fancy? Or had he never intended to keep his promise at all, just playing at romance until reality rode up to his gate? By the time dawn thinned the darkness, she decided none of it mattered. Henderson had done her an unintentional kindness. Whatever came next, whatever she and Eli Dawson became, it would be built on something honest. No flowery lies or painted words, just work, rest, and the quiet rhythm of days that asked for effort instead of illusions. She woke before sunrise, her body still tuned to the city's early bustle. Pulling on her plainest dress, she braided her hair and tiptoed to the kitchen. The scent of coffee reached her before she saw him. "Couldn't sleep?" Eli asked, standing by the stove with a tin mug in hand. "Not used to the quiet," she admitted. In Philadelphia, there was always noise carriages, factory whistles, people shouting in the street. Here it feels like the world stopped moving. He smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it, or it'll drive you clean out of your mind. One or the other." The unexpected humor pulled a small laugh from her. "I'm heading out to check the fences," he said. "Last week's storm likely took a few down. I thought I'd work in the garden, if that's all right. And there's some mending to do. A few shirts looked ready to give up entirely." "You don't have to, I do," she interrupted gently. "If I'm to earn my keep, I intend to earn it properly. I'm not a guest or a charity case. Mr. Dawson, I'm hired help. Remember?" He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. There's a sewing box in the hall closet. Was my mother's needles and thread should still be good." After breakfast, which Clara insisted on cooking despite his protests, Eli saddled his horse. Before he left, he showed her the rifle hanging near the door. "Just in case," he said. "You won't need it, but it's better you know where it is." He pointed out the root cellar, the spring house where he kept milk cool, and the pump by the well. "I'll be back by sunset," he said, tightening the reins. "If you get bored, there are a few books on the shelf. Old ones, but they'll keep you company." Clara watched him ride out, the morning sun burning through the mist. Then she turned to survey what was, for now, her small kingdom. The house needed a woman's touch curtains on the windows, maybe a rug for the floor, but the garden came first. She found tools in the barn and set to work. The earth was stubborn, the sun unrelenting, but she was more determined than either. She weeded the rows, dug small trenches for water, and tied the spindly tomato vines to stakes. By noon, her back ached and blisters had formed over the old calluses on her palms. But when she looked over the garden, it was transformed alive again, promising growth instead of failure. Inside, she discovered the sewing box exactly where Eli had said. It was old, but neatly kept. The contents arranged with a care that spoke of another woman's hands. She found a stack of shirts in need of mending and set up near the window where the light fell strongest. As her fingers worked the needle, a low tune escaped her, an old hymn her mother used to hum while baking bread. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd felt this calm. She was so absorbed she didn't hear the sound of approaching horses until they were nearly at the porch. Looking out, she saw Eli had returned, only he wasn't alone. 3 riders followed him, their clothes dusty, their eyes sharp. Clara straightened, smoothing her hair, untied her apron, and tried to decide what a respectable woman did in such moments. She barely had time to think before the door opened. Eli stepped inside first, his jaw tight. "Miss Whitfield, we've got company. This is Jim Miller, Bob Watson, and Thomas Henderson." The last name hit like a slap. Henderson wasn't, as she remembered from the faded photograph, heavier now. Older, with a florid face and small, mean eyes that darted over her with disdain. "So, this is where you ended up," he drawled. "Should have guessed Dawson would scoop up what falls off my wagon." "Watch your mouth, Tom," Eli said, his voice low. "Just stating facts," Henderson replied, dropping into a chair uninvited. "Heard in Redstone you took in a stray. Thought I'd see the truth of it for myself." Clara kept her voice even. "Gentlemen, would you care for coffee?" Henderson laughed. An ugly sound. "Well, ain't she proper, see, boys? This is why I changed my mind. Could tell from her letters she was too high and mighty. All that talk of reading and music. What good's that to a rancher more good than a man who breaks his word?" Clara said before she could stop herself. The room went still. Henderson's face darkened. "You got something to say to me. Woman, nothing that would improve you, sir." Miller and Watson shifted uneasily. Eli stepped forward, his stance casual but unmistakably protective. "You came to see she's safe. You've seen it. Now leave." Your land Henderson stood, sneering. "For now, sure. But that creek feeding your well runs through my property first. Be a shame if something happened to it. You threatening me?" "Tom, just neighborly advice," Henderson said, Wouldn't want your housekeeper here to go thirsty." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara saw Eli's fists tighten, the muscles along his jaw flex. For a long moment, no one moved. "Get out," he said finally, voice calm but edged with steel. Henderson chuckled and tipped his hat toward her. "See you round. Dawson, Miss Whitfield." They left the way they'd come, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Eli stood motionless, staring at the door long after it closed. The tension in his shoulders was visible, his breath shallow with the effort of restraint. Clara wanted to speak but couldn't find the right words. She simply moved to the table and gathered the untouched coffee pot, giving him the dignity of silence. After a while, he turned toward her. "He won't leave it alone," he said quietly. "That man's not satisfied unless he's got someone to bully. Then he'll have to find someone else," Clara replied. "You're not the sort to scare easy." His eyes met hers steady, storm gray, and unreadable. "Maybe not," he said. "But water's a man's lifeline out here. He cuts that creek, and the ranch dies. Then we won't let him," she said simply. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Eli exhaled and gave a small, weary nod. "You've got grit, Miss Whitfield." Clara managed a faint smile. "I've had practice." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the creek whispered through the cottonwoods, steady, constant, like a promise that the land itself was listening. And though the threat of Henderson lingered in the air, Clara realized something had shifted. This place was no longer just a stranger's refuge. It was beginning, somehow, to feel like her own. "He can't really divert the creek, can he?" Clara asked that night, the lamplight glinting off the rim of her teacup. Eli rubbed a thumb across his jaw. "Legally, no. Water rights were marked when we claimed our land. But out here, law and what a man gets away with don't always line up. So he could try," she said quietly. "He could," Eli admitted. "And I'm sorry. Clara, I shouldn't have dragged you into any of this." She set the cup down, steady despite the faint tremor in her fingers. "You didn't. I came here of my own choosing." Her tone left no room for argument, so Eli only nodded. From the table, he watched her return to her sewing needle flashing in the lamplight, thread pulling through cloth with the precise rhythm of someone used to mending not just fabric but her own life. "Thomas Henderson seems the kind to collect enemies," she said, not looking up. "Men like him always do. Sooner or later, that kind of debt comes due." Something like admiration flickered across Eli's face. "You handled him well today. Most women would have gone pale." "I've met worse," Clara said evenly. "Factory foremen who thought any woman without protection was fair game. Landlords who offered to forgive rent for favors I wouldn't give. At least Henderson's brand of cruelty wears its own name." Eli's eyes softened. "You shouldn't have had to face that. Life is full of things we shouldn't have to face," she replied, snipping a thread. "The measure of a person is how they deal with them anyway." That silenced him. Dinner was simple venison stew she'd coaxed together from a jar of dried meat and the last of the potatoes, but the silence that filled the cabin wasn't strained. It was thoughtful, the kind that sat comfortably between people beginning to trust each other. After a while, Eli spoke again. "Henderson's not done. He'll stir trouble. That's what men like him do. I gathered as much. If you want to reconsider staying." "Do you want me to leave?" The question startled him. "No," he said too quickly, then blinked, surprised by his own certainty. "No, It's been good having someone here, coming home to talk instead of four empty walls." He hesitated. "But I won't have you stay just out of pride if it puts you at risk." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Then let me speak plain. Eli, I have nowhere else to go. No money, no kin waiting back east. You've offered me honest work and a roof over my head that's more kindness than I've known in half a year. Henderson's a bully, not a monster. Men like that bluff loud and strike only when they're sure they'll win." Eli studied her face, as if weighing every word. "You've got him figured for one meeting. I've met his sort before," she said with a faint smile. "Different names, same arrogance whether they wear overalls or tailored suits." He couldn't help the small laugh that escaped him. "You may be right. And, for the record, you're not wrong about the beans, either. I've been frying them the same way for 3 years. Then I suppose I'll have to show you there's more than one way to eat a bean," she said, deadpan. That laugh deepened his first real one, full and easy, and it changed his face. For the first time, he looked younger, almost boyish. "Fair enough. Miss Whitfield, we'll take it one day at a time. Clara," she corrected softly, "if we're sharing a roof, you should call me Clara." He nodded. "Then you'd best call me Eli." The name felt natural, like it had always belonged between them. The days that followed settled into a rhythm more peaceful than either expected. Clara rose before dawn to brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and breakfast was ready by the time Eli came in from his early chores. They ate together in quiet companionship, planning the day's tasks before heading to their separate work. Under her care, the garden flourished. The tomatoes thickened on their vines, the beans climbed their poles, and even the wilting squash began to stretch green leaves toward the sun. Sometimes Eli would pause from mending fences just to watch her, leaning against a post with his hat pushed back and an expression she couldn't quite name. "You've got a gift," he said one evening as she gathered beans into her apron. "Everything you touch seems to come alive." Clara smiled. Plants are simple creatures. They need attention, water, and someone to notice when they're struggling. Give them that, and they'll return the favor. "People aren't much different," he murmured. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the fields, stirring the scent of cut hay and wild sage. Then Eli said, "I tried to grow roses once. My mother's favorite. She brought the cuttings from Virginia, planted them by the porch over there." He pointed to a bare patch of earth near the steps. "They froze that first winter. I didn't know to cover them." Clara glanced toward the spot. "We could try again. Wild roses this time. They're tougher, made for this land." "Maybe," he said, but she caught the glint of hope in his voice. 3 weeks later, she decided it was time to go into town for supplies. Eli had resisted the idea, insisting he should come along, but she'd stood her ground. "I'm not a child. Eli, I can handle a wagon, and I can certainly handle buying flour and fabric." He'd finally relented, though she noticed he cleaned and loaded the rifle before sliding it beneath the wagon seat. "Just in case," he'd said. The town of Redstone was exactly what she expected, one dusty street lined with a general store, blacksmith, saloon, and a small white church that doubled as a schoolhouse. The air smelled of horses and sun-baked wood. When Clara stepped into the general store, conversation lulled for half a beat before resuming in hushed tones. "You'd be the lady staying out at the Dawson place," said the shopkeeper's wife, her tone polite but guarded. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied evenly. "Clara Whitfield. I'm Mr. Dawson's housekeeper." Someone in the back muttered the word housekeeper with a sneer. Clara kept her composure, handing over her list. "I'll also need to see your fabric selection, Mrs. Dobson." "Mary Dobson," the woman said after a pause, her expression softening. "Heard you came west to marry Thomas Henderson." "Plans change," Clara said simply. "That they do." Mary began collecting the items on the list. "Eli Dawson's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself. Helped my husband rebuild our barn after that big storm 2 years back. Wouldn't take a dime for it. He's been very kind." Clara agreed, running her fingers over a bolt of sturdy blue cotton. "This will make good work dresses. Mrs. Dobson smiled faintly. "I expect it will. You hold your head high, Miss Whitfield. Folks out here like to talk, but most don't mean harm. Time will prove the truth of you." As Clara paid and carried her parcels out to the wagon, the wind shifted across the street. For a moment, she thought she saw Thomas Henderson's dark hat near the saloon door, but when she blinked, he was gone. She climbed onto the wagon seat, took the reins in steady hands, and set her eyes on the long road home to Iron Creek Ranch. The sun was lowering behind the hills, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled a promise or a warning. She couldn't yet tell. Kind enough to take in a stranger. "Apparently," came a voice from behind. Clara turned to see a young woman standing near the counter, her dress a crisp green calico and her chin tilted just high enough to signal disapproval. "I'm Sarah Watson," the woman said. "My father owns the Double Bar Ranch." "Miss Watson," Clara acknowledged politely. Sarah's gaze swept over her, cool and appraising. "We've all been wondering what sort of woman answers one of those advertisements." She let the next words drip with disdain. "A mail-order bride. Desperate, I suppose." Heat flushed Clara's face, but she kept her voice even. "Desperate for honest work and a clean slate. Yes, I don't see much shame in either." Sarah gave a brittle laugh. "Is that what they're calling it now? Sarah Watson?" "Mrs." Dobson snapped from behind the counter. "You mind your tongue in my store," but the damage was done. Clara could feel the eyes on her curious, judgmental, unkind. She finished her purchases with as much dignity as she could muster, though her hands shook when she loaded the wagon. "Miss Whitfield." She turned to find an older man approaching, his hat in hand and a clerical collar at his throat. His kind eyes steadied her frayed composure. "I'm Reverend Mills," he said warmly. "I wanted to welcome you to Redstone and invite you to Sunday service. That's very kind of you, Reverend. But I'm not sure everyone is welcome in God's house," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those still watching. "And I mean everyone. We're a small town, Miss Whitfield. Sometimes that makes folks narrow in their thinking. But there's goodness here, too. Give them time." She managed a small smile. "Thank you, Reverend." The words helped more than she expected. Still, the weight of the morning clung to her as she rode home. The sky had darkened, heavy with rain, and the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels seemed to echo the tension in her chest. She told herself she didn't care what Redstone thought, but deep down, she did. When she reached the ranch, Eli was already on the porch, hat low against the wind. He stepped down before the wagon stopped moving. "How was town?" he asked, offering his hand to help her down. "Educational," she said, her tone dry. His jaw tightened. "Who gave you trouble? It doesn't matter," she replied. "People think what they want. Clara Eli." She turned, meeting his eyes squarely. "If I'm to live here, I have to stand on my own 2 feet. I can't have you charging into town every time someone says something unpleasant. That would only prove them right." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're right. But if anyone crosses a line, then I'll tell you," she promised. "Now, help me unload this wagon. I bought fabric for curtains, and you're going to help hang them whether you like it or not." That earned one of his rare, genuine smiles. "Bossy already?" "Huh, efficient," she corrected. "There's a difference." They worked together until dusk, hauling supplies, talking about where curtains might hang best, and laughing over the crooked way Eli tried to measure the windows. The simple domestic task felt like a small rebellion against the ugliness of town gossip, a quiet declaration that they would define this home for themselves. By nightfall, rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, until thunder cracked like a gunshot over the ridge. Clara woke hours later to a flash of lightning that turned the whole room white for an instant. The thunder that followed shook the floorboards. She lay listening until she heard something else beneath the storm. Horses. Uneasy. Snorting. Hooves striking the corral fence. She threw on her robe and hurried to the main room. Eli was already there, pulling on his boots. "The horses are spooked," he said. "This storm's worse than I thought. I've got to get them into the barn. I'll help." "No, stay inside. It's too dangerous," but she was already grabbing her shawl. "We can argue about it, or we can save your horses. Which would you rather?" He exhaled sharply, but didn't argue again. Together, they ran into the night. The wind lashed at them, rain striking like cold needles. The corral gate banged open, and the herd moved in blind panic. One young mare had already gashed her leg against the rail. "They'll break their necks if they keep this up," Eli shouted. Clara's heart hammered, but instinct took over. She began to sing a lullaby her mother used to hum when storms rattled the windows of their old Philadelphia home. Her voice trembled at first, nearly swallowed by the wind, but she kept singing. The nearest horse flicked its ears toward her. Then another. She stepped closer, voice steady now, her hand extended, slowly, impossibly. The mare calmed enough for Clara to slip a rope over her neck. Eli stared, half in disbelief, then followed her example with the others. It took nearly an hour, both of them soaked and shaking. But when the last horse was finally safe inside the barn, Clara was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. Eli pulled a horse blanket from a hook and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary. "That was brave," he said softly. "Foolish, but brave. Like taking in a stranger," she countered, her voice barely above the rain. "Maybe," he said, a faint smile in his eyes. For a heartbeat, the air shifted, charged, fragile. Then lightning struck somewhere close, thunder crashing so loud it felt like the sky had split in two. They both jumped, the moment breaking. "Let's get inside before you catch your death," Eli said, back in the house. Clara changed into dry clothes while he built the fire higher. When he came out of his room, his hair was still damp, curling slightly at his collar. The sight startled her. He looked different, younger, almost gentle. "I made tea," she said, holding out a steaming cup. "Picked some up in town." "Tea," he echoed with amusement. "You keep this up. I'll be eating off china plates before winter. Would that be so terrible?" He took the cup, his large hands dwarfing it. Guess not. They sat in companionable silence, listening as the thunder rolled farther away, Then Eli spoke, voice low. "Why did you really come west? Clara, I know about your father's debts, the factory work, but there had to be other options. Marriage in the city, maybe domestic service. Why here?" Clara stared into the fire. The flames danced, reflected in her eyes like old memories. "Have you ever felt," she said quietly, "like you were living someone else's life, like every decision had already been made for you, and the only thing left was to walk a path you never chose?" Eli didn't answer right away. The fire popped softly between them. "Yeah," he said finally, "I know that feeling." Outside, the last of the rain slid off the roof in silver threads. Inside, the house felt warmer than it ever had before, not from the fire, but from something quieter, something that neither of them dared to name. "Yes," Eli said quietly, staring into the fire, "every day during the war, and every day after for years. That's how I felt like I was living someone else's life." Clara nodded slowly. "That's how it was for me in Philadelphia. After Mother passed, I kept Father's house, handled his letters, hosted his dinners. When he died, everyone assumed I'd marry Harold Westbrook, Father's partner's son. He'd been calling for 2 years. He was appropriate." Here she smiled faintly, without humor. "But when I looked at him, I saw my whole life already mapped out: the marriage, the children, Sunday dinners with his mother, tea with the proper ladies, and little by little I'd vanish until there was no Clara Whitfield left, only Mrs. Harold Westbrook." Eli watched her over the rim of his mug. The firelight flickered across her face, softening its usual restraint. "The factory was terrible," she continued. "Hot, loud, cruel, but it was mine. My choice. And when I saw that advertisement for a wife out west—" "You saw an escape," he said. "I saw a possibility," she corrected gently. "Even if it had worked with Henderson, it would have been my choice, my risk. That alone was worth something." Eli set his cup down and leaned back, thoughtful. "I came west to escape, too. Not a person memories. Things I did in the war. Things I saw. I figured if I got far enough away, worked hard enough, maybe I could leave them behind." "Did it work?" He shook his head. "No, the memories came with me. But the work helps. Putting my hands to something honest, building a fence, breaking the soil that steadies me." His eyes lifted to hers. "Having you here helps too. I didn't realize how much silence I'd been living in until you filled it." Warmth rose in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Eli," she began, but he went on, voice rough. "I know this isn't the life you meant to have. You're making the best of a bad hand. But thank you, not just for the meals or the curtains or the garden, for making this house feel alive again, like a home." Before she could answer, a hard knock rattled the door. Eli was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle from its peg. "Dawson, open up, it's Jim Miller." Eli swung the door open. Miller stood there drenched, mud up to his knees, rain streaming from his hat brim. Henderson's dam gave way. He panted. "The water's tearing down toward the Baxter place. They've got 3 little ones. We need every man we can get." Eli was already pulling on his coat. "Clara, stay here. Those children," Miller began. "Mrs. Baxter's trying to get them to high ground. Her husband's stuck in town." Clara rose. "I'm coming. Clara, no. Don't waste time arguing," she snapped, grabbing her shawl. "We can talk after the children are safe." The ride through the storm was a blur of wind and mud. Rain slashed sideways, turning the road into a river of brown water. Thunder rolled so close it seemed to shake the sky itself. When they reached the Baxter homestead, chaos reigned. The water had already swallowed the yard and was lapping at the porch. Mrs. Baxter was on the roof clutching her 3 children, their screams cutting through the roar of the storm. "We need rope," Eli shouted. Neighbors were arriving from every direction, the Dobsons, the Watsons, even a few men Clara didn't recognize. In a crisis, the frontier forgot its grudges. They formed a human chain, bodies braced against the rushing current. Eli tied a rope around his waist and plunged into the freezing water. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs as she watched him fight his way toward the house. "Hold him steady," Miller yelled, gripping the rope behind. One by one, Eli carried the children through the current and into waiting arms. Mrs. Baxter came last, shaking and sobbing, clutching her youngest to her chest. "My house, everything we own?" "You're alive," Clara said firmly, wrapping her in a blanket someone handed her. "That's what matters. The rest can be built again." All through the night, they worked piling sandbags, hauling boards, digging trenches to redirect the flood. Mud soaked their clothes, and exhaustion blurred the hours. Clara found herself shoulder to shoulder with Sarah Watson, neither speaking until Sarah slipped on the slick ground. Clara caught her arm. "Easy." Sarah steadied herself, blinking rain from her eyes. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Clara nodded. "Out here, we help each other. That's what neighbors do." For a moment, Sarah looked at her, really looked, then nodded back and returned to work. By dawn, the worst of the flooding had passed. The Baxter house was damaged but still standing, the children safe, the water slowly receding into the fields. As the weary crowd began to disperse, the sound of hoofbeats drew every head. Thomas Henderson rode in, dry under his slicker, surveying the destruction with an air of detachment. "Shame about all this," he said. "Act of God, I suppose. Storm hit harder than anyone expected. Your dam was built wrong," Eli answered flatly. "We all told you it wouldn't hold under real rain. You accusing me of something, Dawson." Before Eli could speak, Mr. Baxter galloped up from town, took one look at his wrecked home and terrified wife, and launched himself at Henderson. The 2 men crashed into the mud. It took 3 others to pull them apart. Henderson's nose bled, his hat lost somewhere in the muck. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. "I'll press charges." Sheriff Dixon arrived just in time to hear it. He dismounted slowly, eyeing the scene. "Seems to me," the sheriff said, "a man's got a right to be angry when another man's negligence near kills his family. If I were you, Henderson, I'd ride on home and think real hard about fixing that dam before anyone else gets hurt." A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the crowd. Henderson wiped his face, climbed onto his horse, and rode off without another word. Clara watched him go. The proud set of his shoulders was gone, replaced by something smaller, meaner. Around her, she could see it in the others, the shift. The respect Henderson had once commanded was crumbling, and everyone knew it. Mary Dobson approached as the crowd thinned. "You did good tonight," she said to Clara. "Real good. Maybe I misjudged you." Clara smiled faintly. "We all judge. The trick is knowing when to change our minds." The ride back to Iron Creek Ranch was silent except for the wind. Dawn painted the sky pale gold, and exhaustion sat heavy between them. When they reached the porch, Eli helped Clara down from the wagon. Mud streaked her skirts, and her hair clung damp against her neck. For a moment, neither moved. "You were remarkable tonight," he said finally, his voice low. "The way you took charge, the way you kept everyone calm. You belong here, Clara, in this land, with these people. You belong." She met his eyes, searching. "Do I? Yes." The word came rough, certain. He still held her hands in his, mud-streaked fingers tangled with hers. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach weeks ago, Clara believed him. Not just in his words, but in the way he said them, as if belonging were something they might both still learn. Together. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing the first clean light of morning. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the creek that nearly destroyed everything kept flowing steady, relentless, alive. "More than I ever expected," Eli said quietly. "More than I probably deserve." He let go of her hands, and the fragile moment between them drifted away like smoke. But Clara carried the warmth of it long after she'd gone inside to change out of her muddy clothes. In the days that followed, the town's attitude toward her shifted. Where once she'd met whispers and sidelong looks, now she found nods, smiles, even conversation. Mary Dobson waved from her shop window. The Baxter children ran to her in the street, proud to show their bandaged knees. Reverend Mills thanked her publicly at Sunday service for the courage God plants in good hearts. Even Sarah Watson, dressed in her usual perfect green calico, approached Clara one morning outside the general store. "I owe you an apology," Sarah said, words tumbling fast as if afraid they'd catch on her pride. "I was jealous." Clara blinked. Jealous Sarah folded her arms. "I've been trying to get Eli Dawson's attention for 2 years. Then you show up, and suddenly he can't look at anyone else." Heat flared in Clara's cheeks. "We're not. It's only a working arrangement." Sarah laughed softly, not unkindly this time. "You can keep telling yourself that, but anyone with eyes can see how he looks at you and how you look at him." Clara said nothing, but that night her mind replayed Sarah's words while she watched Eli across the supper table. She noticed things she hadn't before, or maybe things she'd been pretending not to see, the way he gentled the horses with quiet patience, the way he crouched to speak softly to the neighbor children who came to see the foals, the small smile that crept over his face when she talked about her day. And sometimes, when she was working in the garden or kneading bread, she'd glance up to find him watching her, his expression unguarded and warm, as if he were seeing something he hadn't believed could exist anymore. By early autumn, the air turned crisp, and Clara's garden became a small miracle of color. Tomatoes reddened in the sun, beans dried in their pods, squash ripened fat and golden. She showed Eli how to preserve them, how to can the tomatoes, string the beans, cure the squash for winter storage. One evening, as they sat cutting apples for drying, Eli smiled at the full cellar shelves. "We make a good team," he said. "We do." She agreed, pausing to wipe her hands. "Eli, what happens when winter comes?" He looked up. "What do you mean? This arrangement, my position here, is it permanent?" He set down his knife, meeting her eyes. "Do you want it to be?" The question settled between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Clara thought of the life she'd built here, the rhythm of the days, the quiet evenings by the fire, the neighbors who now called her by name, and Eli. "I don't have anywhere else I'd rather be," she said softly. "Then stay," he answered simply. "As long as you want." Forever, if it suits you. Forever. The word might have frightened her once, but now it wrapped around her like a promise she hadn't known she needed. That night, as she prepared for bed, she saw the faint glow of a lantern through her window, the barn door open. Eli's silhouette moving among the horses. His voice carried faintly in the wind, calm and low. Watching him, she thought of Sarah's teasing words, of the warmth in his eyes, and of the way her heart leapt when he smiled. She had come west out of desperation, seeking safety and work. But somewhere between sunrise and sunset, she had found something more. This wasn't mere survival anymore, it was building, choosing, belonging. A soft knock broke her reverie. "Clara, you awake?" "Yes, come in." Eli stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking almost uneasy. "I've been thinking about what you said, the whole business of permanence, and I realized something. I never actually paid you." Clara blinked in surprise. It was true. They had slipped into routine so naturally she'd forgotten about wages entirely. "I have room and board. That's plenty." He shook his head. "No, it isn't. Not for what you've done." He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket. "This is what I owe you for the past 3 months, plus a little extra for making this place worth coming home to." She accepted the pouch, surprised by its weight. It was more than generous enough to buy her passage back east, even to start a new life somewhere else if she wished. "Eli, this is too much. It's yours," he said firmly. "Do with it what you will. Stay. Go, it's your choice. I just want you to know you have one." Clara understood. He was giving her what she'd come west to find, freedom. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Clara, I hope you stay. Not because you need to, but because you want to, because this feels like home." When he was gone, she sat on the bed holding the pouch. She could leave. She could start fresh somewhere else. Free of gossip. Free of the uncertain tension that had begun to stir between them. But the thought of leaving, the thought of never hearing his laughter, never sharing another quiet supper, never walking through the garden they'd built together, filled her with an ache deeper than fear. She had come west as a mail-order bride, desperate and alone. But she had found something better than the security she'd sought. She had found belonging, work that mattered, and a man who saw her not as an obligation or a solution to loneliness, but as herself. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would tell him she was staying. Not for the wages, not for shelter, but for the chance to build something lasting, something that was truly theirs. For the first time since her father's death, the future didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a beginning. The next morning dawned clear and sharp. Clara was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the unmistakable sound of carriage wheels crunching along the dirt road. A carriage here was strange enough, but this one gleamed with polished brass and city elegance, so out of place against the rugged prairie backdrop that she froze mid-motion. The horses stopped near the gate, and a woman stepped out first, middle-aged, finely dressed, her expression sharp as a blade. Behind her came a younger man in an immaculate gray coat, his hair slicked back in the familiar style of Philadelphia society. Her heart sank. "Henry Westbrook. Clara," he called, relief and reprimand tangled in his voice. "Thank heaven we found you." She took a step back. "Henry, what on earth are you doing here? I come to take you home." "Home." The word tasted strange. "How did you even—" your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, wrote to Mother after seeing you at the train station. It took time to track you down, but here we are." The older woman, Mrs. Margaret Westbrook, surveyed the ranch with obvious distaste. "So, this is where you've been living like some hired servant." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I live here as Mr. Dawson's housekeeper, and I'm content. Housekeeper, Mrs." Westbrook's lips pinched tighter. "Nonsense. You're a Whitfield, for heaven's sake. You belong in Philadelphia, not in this wilderness." Henry stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Clara, please, come back with us. You don't have to stay in this place. Everyone's been worried sick. My mother, she blames herself for letting you go." "Letting me go," she echoed, a flicker of anger cutting through her shock. "Henry, no one let me go. I left because I needed to." He looked bewildered. Needed to. For what, to live in a shack and bake bread for a ranch hand? Before Clara could speak, a shadow fell across them. Eli had come from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable but his stance protective. "Morning," he said evenly. "Can I help you folks?" Henry turned, eyes narrowing. "You must be Dawson. I suppose you think keeping a woman like Miss Whitfield here is some kind of prize." Henry Clara began, but Eli's tone stopped him cold. "Miss Whitfield works here of her own choosing," he said calmly. "You'd best remember that." Mrs. Westbrook sniffed, unimpressed. "Choosing? You mean she's forgotten what she owes her family name?" Clara straightened, her voice steady. "No, Mrs. Westbrook, I haven't forgotten. I've simply decided to define it myself." The older woman's eyes flashed, but Eli's quiet presence beside her, broad-shouldered, grounded, unflinching, made the words die in her throat. The prairie wind stirred between them, carrying the faint scent of hay and autumn apples. For the first time, Clara felt no pull toward the life she'd left behind, only the fierce certainty that this was where she was meant to stand. And for the first time, the Philadelphia Clara Whitfield and the Dakota Clara felt like the same woman. "I've been working," Clara said evenly, brushing dust from her hands. "Honest work for honest pay." "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret Westbrook snapped, her voice sharp as frost. "Henry has graciously agreed to overlook this adventure of yours. You'll return to Philadelphia, marry properly, and we'll pretend this never happened." Clara let out a soft laugh before she could stop herself. "Overlook graciously, Clara." "Please," Henry said, stepping forward. "I know you were grieving your father, not thinking clearly. But this has gone far enough. You don't belong here." "Don't I?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Her gaze took in his spotless gloves, the polished boots that had never met mud, and the thin softness of hands that had never held a tool. His entire posture radiated confidence born of assumption. "And I belong with you?" "Of course you do," he said with a patient smile. "We've been intended for each other since we were children, intended by whom Clara asked, not by me." Before Henry could respond, movement near the barn caught her eye. Eli was walking toward them, sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable but his presence grounding. "Henry, Mrs. Westbrook," Clara said. "This is Mr. Dawson. I work as his housekeeper. For now, Mrs." Westbrook replied dismissively, "Get your things, girl. We have a train to catch." "No." The single word cut clean through the morning air. Henry's expression hardened. "Clara, don't be foolish. You can't mean to stay here, living as a servant, when you could be my wife." "I mean exactly that," she said. "I intend to make my own choices, and I choose to stay." Henry gestured toward Eli with a sneer. "For him, for this cowboy." Eli's voice was calm but carried an edge that silenced them both. The ladies made her decision. "You should be on your way." "Who do you think you are?" Henry demanded. "I'm the man whose property you're standing on," Eli said evenly. "And I'm asking you to leave." Margaret Westbrook grabbed her son's arm. "Come, Henry. She's made her bed. Let her lie in it." Henry turned one last time, anger clouding his face. "You'll regret this. Clara, when you're old and worn down from work, when your hands are rough and your back bent, you'll wish you'd come with me." Clara's throat tightened, but she stood her ground. "Better to earn my place than to live someone else's idea of it." Henry hesitated, then turned away. The carriage wheels ground against the dirt, fading into the distance. When the sound was gone, silence filled the air. Clara felt it then, the weight of her decision. She had refused her last tie to the life she was raised for: comfort, certainty, social grace. It was both terrifying and liberating. "You all right?" Eli asked quietly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I might have just made the biggest mistake of my life, or the best decision." He studied her face, then said softly, "That man, you could have loved him." "Never." The word came easily. "He would have wanted me small and silent. He'd have never seen me as I am." Eli's eyes softened. "And how are you?" She turned to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Strong, capable, worth more than being someone's idea of a perfect wife." "Yes," he said, his voice low. "You're all that and more." The look that passed between them was charged and unspoken, but before either could name it, the sound of hooves broke the spell. Sheriff Mark Dixon rode up fast, mud spattering his boots as he dismounted. "Mornin', Dawson, Miss Whitfield," he said, tipping his hat, his face grave. "I've got news you'll want to hear. Thomas Henderson's been arrested." Eli's jaw tightened. "For what fraud?" the sheriff said. "Turns out he's been running a scam across half the eastern seaboard, placing false advertisements for mail-order brides, collecting money for travel expenses, then abandoning the women once they arrived." "Miss Whitfield, you were lucky. You're the only one who actually made it to his gate." Clara went still. "How many sicks we know of?" the sheriff replied grimly. Most were too ashamed to talk, tried to make their way home, but the latest one, Miss Catherine Parker, went straight to the authorities. She's staying at the hotel in Redstone. Might appreciate speaking with someone who understands her situation. When the sheriff left, Clara stood silent for a long time, the words echoing in her head. She'd believed Henderson had simply lost interest in her specifically, but this wasn't rejection. It was cruelty, calculated and repeated. "I'll take you to town tomorrow," Eli said gently. "If you want to see her." "Yes," Clara said. "I want to." The next day, the hotel parlor smelled faintly of coffee and coal oil. Catherine Parker sat near the window, pale and shaken, her hands twisting the handkerchief in her lap. She could not have been more than 20. "I sold everything," Catherine whispered when Clara introduced herself. "My mother's pearls, my father's watch. I thought I was coming to start a new life, a respectable marriage. Instead," her voice broke, and she began to sob. Clara sat beside her and took her trembling hands. "You're not alone," she said gently. "I know what that kind of hope feels like and what it's like when it shatters." Catherine looked up, tears streaking her face. What am I supposed to do now? I have nothing left." Clara squeezed her hands. "You start again, one step at a time. It's the only way I know." A knock came at the parlor door. Eli stood there, hat in hand. "Miss Parker," he said quietly, "I spoke with Reverend Mills. He and his wife have a spare room and would be glad to take you in while you get your footing. Mrs. Mills could use help at the schoolhouse if you're willing." Catherine blinked in disbelief. "They'd do that for me. For a stranger. That's what decent folks do," Eli said simply. "And there are more decent folks here than you think." Catherine began to cry again, but this time it was with relief. Clara helped her gather her few belongings, and together they walked her down to the small white parsonage behind the church. Mrs. Mills greeted them with open arms, ushering the girl inside with warm tea and quiet assurances. As they walked back toward the wagon, Clara glanced at Eli. "You arranged that before we even came, didn't you?" He shrugged. Didn't seem right to just tell her it would get better. Sometimes you have to help it along. She smiled. "You paid for her board too, didn't you?" He didn't answer, only adjusted the brim of his hat. Back at the ranch, Clara found herself watching him differently. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude anymore, it was recognition. Here was a man who didn't speak much of kindness, but lived it without needing praise. That night, as the prairie wind moved softly through the open windows, Clara lay awake, thinking of Catherine Parker, of the women who'd been lost, and of the man who'd quietly restored one small piece of justice in a world that so often forgot mercy. When Eli passed her door on his way to bed, she almost called out to him, but instead she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." And somewhere down the hall, she thought she heard him pause as if he'd heard her just the same. "Could have been you," Eli said quietly as they rode back toward Iron Creek Ranch. His voice was roughened by the cold wind and something heavier beneath it. "If I hadn't been riding by that day, if I hadn't stopped, I don't like thinking about what might have happened. But you did stop," Clara reminded him gently. "You chose to help a stranger when you didn't have to." He glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe I recognize something in you," he said. "Someone who refuses to let life break her. A survivor." They rode the rest of the way in silence, the steady rhythm of the horses the only sound between them. But Clara noticed the way Eli's jaw tightened, the way his gaze lingered on the distant horizon as if wrestling with a truth he'd carried too long. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon. His hands lingered around hers a heartbeat longer than they needed to. "Clara," he said finally, "there's something I need to tell you, about why I've been living out here alone, why I kept to myself for so long." She looked at him, sensing the weight of what he was about to say. "I'm listening." He took a slow breath. "I was married once. Her name was Margaret. We were wed just before I left for the war. 3 days together, that's all we had." His voice caught slightly. "While I was away, fever hit our town. Took her, took half the people I'd grown up with. I didn't even know until I came home 6 months later." Clara's heart ached at the quiet grief behind his words. "Eli, I'm so sorry." He turned toward the fading light over the prairie. "After that, I couldn't stay in Virginia. Every street, every church bell, every window reminded me of her. So I came west, built this place, told myself I was done caring about anyone that way." He turned back to her, eyes steady. "Then you showed up at Henderson's gate proud, desperate, Brave, and everything I'd locked away just came apart. Clara could barely breathe. What are you saying? I'm saying having you here changed everything. This house isn't just four walls anymore, it's a home. The days don't feel endless, they feel worth something, and He faltered, shaking his head. I'm no good with words. Margaret always said I was better with horses than people. You're doing just fine, Clara whispered. He smiled faintly, eyes warm but uncertain. If you want to stay, really stay, not as my housekeeper, but as my partner, I'd like that. More than like it. He stopped again, frustration in his voice. Clara stepped closer, her heart pounding. Eli Dawson, are you trying to propose to me? He gave a rueful chuckle. I'm making a poor mess of it. I had it all planned what I'd say, how I'd say it, but looking at you now, I've lost every word I thought I had. He took a breath and met her gaze. Clara Whitfield, you came here to marry a stranger. Would you consider marrying a friend instead? Someone who knows you're strong and capable and far too good for him, but who'll spend the rest of his life trying to deserve you. Tears stung Clara's eyes. You already do, she said softly. You have since the day you refused to leave me stranded at that gate. His voice dropped. So that's a yes. That's a yes. His kiss was hesitant at first, tender, as if afraid the moment might vanish. Clara answered with certainty, the kind that came from every hardship that had brought her here to this man, this life. When they finally pulled apart, Eli's smile was unguarded, open in a way she'd never seen. We'll have to tell folks, make it official. She laughed, light and free. From what I hear, everyone in town already assumes it. Sarah Watson told me the Valley's been placing bets on when you'd finally ask. Eli groaned good-naturedly. Sarah Watson needs better hobbies, but his grin gave him away. 3 weeks later, under a sky the color of blue glass, Clara Whitfield became Clara Dawson. It was a crisp October morning. The mountains blazed gold with aspen leaves, and the valley turned out in full to fill Redstone's small wooden church. Reverend Mills stood at the altar, his voice deep and kind, as sunlight spilled through the windows onto faces familiar and new. Catherine Parker stood beside Clara, glowing with newfound confidence. She'd flourished under the care of the Mills family, now helping teach the children at the schoolhouse. Eli's longtime friend, Jim Miller, acted as best man, tugging at his collar and muttering about how much he hated formal clothes. Clara wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, cream-colored wool, trimmed with the pearl buttons she'd salvaged from her old Philadelphia gown. Eli's suit was pressed but slightly rumpled, his dark hair refusing to stay in place. He looked at her as if no one else in the room existed. When Reverend Mills reached the part about objections, someone in the back muttered, "About time," and the entire church burst into laughter. The reception that followed took place at Iron Creek Ranch. Tables stretched across the yard, covered in homemade food and wildflower centerpieces. Neighbors arrived with pies and cider, bread and roasted meats. Lanterns hung from the trees, flickering like fireflies as dusk settled. Even a few of Henderson's former ranch hands showed up, grateful for work on other ranches after his property had been sold to repay his debts. There was music, laughter, the squeal of children chasing one another through the tall grass. From the porch, Clara watched Eli dance clumsily with little Lucy Baxter standing on his boots, the child's laughter echoing into the warm evening air. "You've done well for yourself," Mary Dobson said, joining her with 2 mugs of cider. Clara smiled. Better than if things had gone according to plan. Sometimes the best things come from the worst places, Mary said. He loves you, you know. The whole valley can see it. Clara's eyes softened as she watched her husband lift Lucy into the air, both of them laughing. I love him, too, more than I ever thought possible. Mary nodded. Good. That's the way it ought to be. As winter crept over the Dakota hills, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Clara and Eli worked side by side, their movements unspokenly in sink mending fences, feeding livestock, planning for spring. The first snow came early, blanketing Iron Creek Ranch in pristine white. Clara stood at the window, transfixed by the world turned silver under morning light. Different from Philadelphia snow, I imagine, Eli murmured behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She smiled, leaning back against him. Everything's different here. Cleaner. Truer. Outside, the land stretched endless and silent, untouched and alive. Inside, the warmth of their small home, the crackle of the fire, the scent of pine and bread wrapped around them like a promise. For the first time, Clara realized she wasn't running anymore. She'd found the life she'd been searching for, not perfect, not easy, but honest. And as the snow fell softly beyond the window, she thought, this was what belonging felt like. Colder, too. Eli warned as he tossed another log into the fire, wait until January. You'll be cursing the cold and dreaming of Philadelphia's steam heat. But Clara didn't curse the cold when it came. She found beauty in it, the glassy surface of frozen creeks catching morning light. The lacework of frost that spread across the windows, the way their breath mingled in pale clouds as they worked side by side in the barn. The air was sharp, alive, and she loved the quiet rhythm of their days. The house stayed warm from the constant crackle of the hearth Eli kept fed, and the long evenings gave them something they'd rarely had before time to talk, to listen, to remember. Eli spoke of the war in slow fragments, as if the memories were heavy stones he could only lift one at a time. He told her of battles that still haunted his dreams, of comrades buried in fields long forgotten, and of the boy he'd been before the war had turned him into someone harder, quieter. Clara, in turn, spoke of her mother's lingering illness, her father's slow decline afterward, and the suffocating weight of Philadelphia society, how the expectations had pressed in until she couldn't breathe. We're both refugees, she said one night, her voice soft in the flickering lamplight, running from different ghosts, but running all the same, not running anymore. Eli murmured, pulling her closer. Not now that we've found where we belong. For the first time, Clara truly believed him. In mid-December, a letter arrived that would shake that peace. It came by the morning post from the Redstone station, the handwriting unfamiliar but the name unmistakable, Ann Dawson. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. He read silently, then again, his expression darkening. It's from my sister, he said finally. Our father's dying. She's asking me to come home. Clara sat beside him, reading the pain etched across his face. I haven't spoken to him in 4 years, Eli said quietly. We fought after Margaret died. He called me a coward for leaving Virginia, said I was abandoning my duty. I said things I shouldn't have. We never spoke again. Do you want to go? She asked. I don't know. He stared at the paper in his hand. Part of me does. He's my father, after all. But part of me," he trailed off, "is afraid," Clara finished softly. "Afraid of reopening old wounds, of facing the man who made you leave in the first place." Eli nodded. "Something like that." She took his hand in both of hers. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you. If you want to go, we'll go together. If you stay, we'll write. But don't let fear make the choice for you." 2 days later, they were on a train heading east. The journey took a week. Each mile seemed to peel back a layer of calm from Eli, leaving him tense and silent, his eyes distant. Clara tried to coax him to talk, but often he'd only stare out the window, watching the snow-covered plains give way to wooded hills and rivers choked with ice. As the train crossed into Virginia, she laid her hand over his. "Talk to me," she said softly. "Don't disappear into yourself." He exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the rolling hills outside. "I used to love this land. Every ridge, every stream had a story. Now, all I see are battlefields, places where boys died too young. That field there," he nodded toward the window. "My unit camped there the night before Cedar Creek. Half of them never came home." Clara squeezed his hand. "But you did. You survived. You built a new life. That counts for something." He turned toward her, his eyes shadowed. "My father wouldn't agree. He always said I abandoned my heritage." "Your father doesn't live your life," Clara replied gently. "You do." The Dawson plantation lay smaller than she'd imagined, worn, tired, the grandeur of its past fading beneath cracked paint and unkempt fences. The tobacco fields lay fallow, the barns half empty. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Ann Dawson met them at the door, a slim woman with worry lines and tired eyes. She threw her arms around her brother. "Thank God you came," she whispered. "He's been asking for you. He won't let go until he sees you." Inside, the once grand home bore scars of both time and war. The furniture was sturdy but faded, and the silence carried a kind of reverence and regret. James Dawson lay in the upstairs bedroom. The man who'd once commanded soldiers and slaves alike, now shrunken by illness. But the fire in his eyes had not gone out. "So," he rasped when Eli entered, "you came after all? Thought you'd be too stubborn." Eli's voice was even, quiet. "Learned that from you?" The old man's gaze shifted to Clara, studying her sharply. "This your wife?" "Yes, sir," Eli said. James gave a faint nod. "Pretty, strong, too, from the look of her." "Good. You'll need that out there." Over the next 3 days, father and son talked cautiously at first, then with growing honesty. Sometimes their voices rose, sometimes fell to whispers that only the two of them could understand. Clara left them to it, helping Ann with meals, laundry, whatever needed doing. He was different before the war. Ann told her one evening while they worked in the kitchen. Quick to laugh, always teasing me. Margaret brought that out again for a while. When she died, we lost him. I thought we'd lost him forever. Clara smiled faintly. "He's finding his way back. It's slow, but he's finding it." On the third night, James Dawson's breathing grew shallow. Ann sat at his bedside, tears streaking her cheeks, while Eli knelt beside her, gripping his father's frail hand. With effort, the old man turned his head. "I was wrong," he whispered, "about you leaving. You had to find your own way. I see that now." His gaze moved to Clara. "Take care of him. He needs someone strong." "I will." she said softly, her throat tight. James Dawson took one final breath just before dawn. The house fell silent, the kind of silence that comes when a chapter closes for good. The funeral was small. The war had scattered families and thinned congregations, but those who came spoke respectfully of James Dawson, a hard man, but fair in his way. Afterward, Anne pulled her brother aside beneath the old oak by the graveyard fence. "Father left everything to you," she said. "The house, the land. It's yours if you want it." Eli looked over the fields that had once defined his life, then at the woman standing beside him. "No," he said quietly, "that belongs to who I used to be, not the man I am now." Anne nodded, relief softening her features. "Then I'll sell it. Maybe use the money to restore what's left. That's what Father would have wanted," Eli said. On the train, heading west again, Eli sat beside Clara, his hand resting loosely over hers. Outside, the Virginia hills faded into winter haze. "Do you regret not staying?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, that life, that land, it belongs to another man, the one who went to war and came back lost. The man I am now belongs to Iron Creek, to the life we're building together. That's what's real." He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Thank you for coming with me. I couldn't have faced it alone." Clara smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "You'll never have to face anything alone again." The train rolled on toward the setting sun, carrying them home not to the place they'd come from, but to the one they'd chosen together. When Clara and Eli Dawson returned to Iron Creek Ranch, they found it in better shape than when they had left. The horses had been fed, the chickens looked well cared for, and someone had even stacked the firewood neatly beside the barn. Inside, the floors gleamed, the hearth was swept, and a folded note waited on the kitchen table in Mary Dobson's familiar handwriting. "This is what neighbors do." Clara smiled as she read the note aloud. Eli let out a low whistle and shook his head. "Mary runs half this valley by sheer willpower. She runs it with kindness," Clara said, tucking the note away. "That's rarer than power." Winter closed in hard across the Dakota plains, the kind of cold that silenced everything but the wind and the cracking ice on the river. Inside the ranch house, life slowed to the rhythm of the fire. Clara spent her days cooking, mending, reading the few books she had brought from Philadelphia. Eli worked in the barn or came in smelling of hay and leather, stamping snow from his boots. But beneath that calm rhythm, something new stirred, subtle at first, then undeniable. Clara had been sick for a week before she began to suspect. At first, she blamed bad meat or the harsh weather. She kept busy, pushing herself through chores, until one morning when Mary stopped by unannounced. Mary took one look at Clara, her pallor, her restless energy, the way her hands strayed protectively to her middle and raised a brow. "How far along are you?" Dear Clara froze, her spoon mid-air. Along, Mary grinned, hands on her hips. "You're glowing, and not from the cold. Don't play innocent with me. You're going to have a baby." The words struck her like sunlight breaking through clouds. She blinked, once, twice, and then laughed, breathless and disbelieving. That evening, when Eli came in from feeding the horses, she told him. At first, he just stared at her, silent. Then the meaning hit, and his expression shifted, shock giving way to joy, then awe, then something so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. He reached for her, pulling her close, his hands trembling slightly, A baby, he whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. Our baby Clara nodded. You're not disappointed. Disappointed. He laughed softly, brushing her cheek with his thumb. Clara, I thought that part of my life ended years ago. This is a miracle. From that moment on, Eli became a man possessed. He followed her everywhere, fussing when she lifted a pail or tried to knead bread. Clara, equal parts amused and exasperated, finally declared, Eli Dawson, I'm pregnant, not fragile. Women in these parts have birthed children while hauling water and chasing cattle. You'll have to let me do my share. He relented mostly, though he still found excuses to check on her a dozen times a day. His worry softened into affection. Each night, his hand would find its way to her growing belly, his voice low and reverent as he whispered about the life forming there. By spring, the snow melted into rivers of mud, and the land awakened again. The work doubled fences to mend, new calves to tend, the garden to plant, but Clara insisted on helping. She claimed it eased her back and lifted her spirits. Eli grumbled but didn't stop her. The days passed in a golden blur until one bright May afternoon when Clara, down on her knees in the garden, heard horses in the distance. At first, she thought nothing of it. Riders often passed along the road to Redstone, but then she noticed the sound wasn't steady. Too many hooves, moving too fast. When she looked up, her blood ran cold. Thomas Henderson sat at their gate, his hat low, a sneer curling his lips. He had 6 men with him, all armed, all mean-eyed and hungry for trouble. Afternoon, Mrs. Dawson, he called mockingly. Her voice came out steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. You're not welcome here, Mr. Henderson. Now, that's no way to greet an old acquaintance, he drawled. Heard you've gone and made yourself respectable. Marriage, baby on the way, the whole fairy tale. Ain't that something? His gaze slid over her, and she felt her stomach twist. State your business or leave, she said coldly. He laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. My business. Your husband cost me everything, my land, my reputation, my money. And now I'm supposed to just fade away while you two play happy family. Before Clara could answer, a familiar click echoed from the barn. Eli stepped out, rifle in hand, his stance calm but ready. You've got 10 seconds to get off my land, he said, voice like stone. Henderson smirked. 7 of us, 1 of you, don't much like your odds. Dawson, maybe you ought to count again, came a voice from the east. Jim Miller rode in, rifle across his saddle. From the west came Bob Watson, and behind him 2 more riders, neighbors, friends. Within minutes, the open plain filled with figures on horseback, a dozen men and women armed and silent, forming a wall of defiance. Sheriff Mark Dixon arrived last, his star glinting in the sun. He reined in beside Eli and tipped his hat. Afternoon, gentlemen. Tom Henderson, you're trespassing. Now, you can ride out quiet, or I can haul you back to Redstone in irons. Your choice. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then Henderson spat in the dirt. This isn't over. Dawson, yes, it is, Eli said. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. You come near my wife or this ranch again, and I won't wait for the sheriff. That's not a threat, Sheriff Dixon added. That's a promise backed by law. Henderson glared, then wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following reluctantly. Dust rose in their wake, fading into the horizon. Clara exhaled shakily, realizing only then how tightly she'd been gripping her hoe. Within moments, neighbors surrounded her, Mary pressing a cup of water into her hands, Sarah Watson fussing with her shawl, the men talking in low voices near the barn. "He won't try again," Sheriff Dixon said firmly. "He steps one toe wrong, and he'll be in jail for a long spell. You have my word." That night, the ranch was quiet again, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, his jaw taut, staring at the dying fire. "He frightened you," Clara said softly. "He threatened you," Eli replied, his voice rough. "You and the baby. That's everything to me. I should have—" He stopped himself, fists clenched. "You should have done exactly what you did," she interrupted gently. "You stood your ground. You protected us without becoming the kind of man he is." He looked at her, eyes dark with emotion. "I don't ever want you scared again." Clara reached for his hand and guided it to her belly, where their child stirred beneath her skin. "We're safe, Eli, because of you. Henderson's finished. He can't touch what we've built here, outside." Wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of summer. That promise came on a sweltering July night, as thunder rolled across the plains. Dr. Henry Collins arrived, followed by Mary Dobson and Sarah Watson. Eli paced the main room like a man possessed, his boots leaving tracks across the wooden floor. Hours passed, groans, hurried footsteps, whispered prayers until at last a sharp cry split the stillness. Then silence. Then the sound of a baby's first breath, thin but strong. Eli froze, his heart pounding. When Mary opened the door, her smile was radiant. "It's a boy," she said, "and both mother and child are doing just fine." Eli stepped into the room, his hands trembling as Clara looked up from the bed, their son bundled against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers grasped one of hers, and she laughed through her tears. "Meet your father," she whispered. Eli knelt beside them, awe written across his face. "Welcome home, little one." Outside, the rain finally stopped. Over Iron Creek, dawn broke clear and golden, lighting the world they had built together, hard-earned, fragile, and utterly theirs. The first cries of baby James had turned Iron Creek Ranch into a home that hummed with life. For months, laughter filled the air, tiny giggles from the cradle, soft conversations by lamplight, and the rhythmic creak of the old rocking chair Eli had built with his own hands. Neighbors came in waves bearing gifts, jars of preserves, knitted booties, small wooden toys. Jim Miller arrived with a hand-carved rocking horse that made Clara tear up, while Sarah Watson shyly brought a quilt stitched with blue stars. Even young Catherine Parker, now engaged to the sheriff's deputy, stopped by beaming, her happiness bright as spring sunlight. "You saved me, Mrs. Dawson," she told Clara. Clara smiled. "You saved yourself, dear. We just helped you stand again." By late autumn, the valley settled into a comfortable rhythm. Eli had become the kind of father everyone admired, steady, tender, endlessly patient. He took night feedings when the baby fussed, carried James in a sling while he worked the barn, and narrated his every task as though teaching his son the language of the land. Clara would often pause at the window just to watch them. One evening, as gold light spilled over the hills, she found Eli standing at the fence, the baby in his arms, pointing out the sunset. The sight made her heart ache with a quiet, contented wonder. "A year ago," she murmured, joining them. "I thought my life was over. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Eli looked down at her, eyes soft. "You came west to marry a stranger," he said, "and I'm still trying to be worthy of that chance." She smiled. "You're not a stranger anymore. You're home." But peace on the frontier was fragile. That winter, Thomas Henderson tried one last desperate act. Out of bitterness and spite, he dammed Iron Creek upstream, hoping to choke off the ranch's water. The plan failed spectacularly. When word spread, every rancher in the valley rode out to tear down the illegal barrier. Sheriff Mark Dixon himself arrived to witness it and finally arrested Henderson for attempted destruction of property and water rights violations. As the sheriff led him away, Henderson's glare cut like ice, but Clara stood firm, James in her arms, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become family. "It's over," Eli said quietly. Clara shook her head with a small smile. "No, love, it's just beginning." Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting fast and flooding the pastures with new life. The air carried the scent of lilac and thawed earth, and baby James, now crawling, seemed determined to explore every inch of it. Clara barely turned her back before finding him tugging on the dog's tail or chewing on a bootlace. Life felt full and ordinary, which on the Dakota frontier was the greatest blessing of all. Then, one bright morning in May, the rhythm broke. Clara was kneading bread while James babbled at her feet, stacking wooden blocks. When she heard hoofbeats pounding up the road, through the window, she saw young Tommy Miller, barely 16, riding hard, dust trailing behind him. His face was pale beneath the sun. "Mrs. Dawson," he shouted before his horse even stopped. "You need to come quick. There's been a cave-in at Iron Ridge Mine. My pa says to bring any medicine you've got." Clara's blood went cold. The silver mine had opened 6 months earlier, promising prosperity but bringing new dangers with every dig. She dropped everything, gathering bandages, alcohol, laudanum, and clean cloths. She was bundling James when Eli galloped into the yard, already reading the alarm on her face. How bad, he demanded. 7 trapped, Tommy said, voice cracking. "Maybe more. They've got 3 out, but that's enough." Eli said gently, "You've done right, son. Take Mrs. Dawson and the baby to town. I'll get more men and head for the mine." The scene at Iron Ridge was a nightmare. Smoke and dust hung in the air. Women stood in clusters, some sobbing, others staring into nothing, lips moving silently in prayer. Men shouted orders, shovels clanged, and the metallic tang of fear clung to everything. Clara handed James to Mary Dobson, who had arrived just ahead of her, and ran to where Dr. Henry Collins was tending the injured. Her training from years caring for her ill mother came back in a rush. She tore strips of linen, cleaned wounds, and whispered words of comfort to men whose faces she barely recognized through the grime. One of the injured was Samuel Watson, Sarah's older brother. His leg was crushed, twisted at an angle that made Clara's stomach turn. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands slick with his blood, tears streaming down her face. "Please," Sarah whispered, looking up at Clara, "help him. Please, there's a chance," Clara said, steady but kind. "But we need to move fast." They worked together for hours, Clara, the doctor, and every pair of willing hands. They bound wounds, cleared airways, and carried stretchers. The rescue team at the tunnel mouth shouted orders, voices hoarse. Now and then, a silence fell, heavy and terrible, when another man failed to answer the calls echoing down the shaft. By late afternoon, They'd pulled out 5 survivors. The rest were still missing. When Eli arrived, his face streaked with dust and sweat. Clara's relief was so fierce it almost hurt. He joined the rescue crew without hesitation, prying away fallen beams, his strength and calm anchoring everyone around him. Hours passed. The sun sank behind the ridge, throwing long shadows over the wreckage. The last of the trapped men, a boy no older than Tommy, was finally dragged free, coughing but alive. When the air cleared and the doctor confirmed the count, a ragged cheer went up. Out of 20 men, 14 had survived, 6 would never return home. Eli stood beside Clara as the crowd began to disperse. Exhaustion etched deep into his features. The mine owners promised compensation, but everyone knew it would never be enough. "They'll call it an accident," he said bitterly, "but I've seen that tunnel. It was greed, not chance. They cut corners to save money." Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Then we'll speak up. We owe them that." That night, after the last wounded were tended and the families gathered their dead, Clara and Eli rode home beneath a sky washed clean by starlight. The wind carried the scent of pine and sorrow. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Eli reached for her hand. "You shouldn't have come," he said softly. "It was dangerous." She shook her head. "You forget I've been in danger before, and those men needed help." He glanced at her, pride and love warring in his eyes. "I know. That's who you are. You run toward the fire when everyone else runs away." They reached Iron Creek close to midnight. Inside, the house was still, baby James sleeping soundly in his cradle. Clara sank into the rocking chair, exhaustion washing over her. Eli knelt beside her, resting his head against her knee. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "of how much can change in a single day. We could have lost so many more. We could have," she agreed, brushing his hair back. "But we didn't. Not today." Outside, the creek murmured softly in the dark, flowing steady and sure a heartbeat through the land. Clara listened to it as Eli rose, lifted James from the cradle, and placed the child in her arms. For a long moment, they sat together in the quiet glow of the fire, their son sleeping between them. The world could break without warning. She knew that now. But as she looked at Eli, tired, strong, alive, Clara also knew this truth whatever storms the frontier brought. They would face them together. The sun rose warm and gold over the Dakota hills, touching Iron Creek Ranch with the kind of quiet peace that only comes after hardship. Life had settled into a gentle rhythm again. The echoes of the cave-in still haunted the valley, but the living pressed forward, as pioneers always did. Robert Henley's funeral had drawn every soul from Redstone and beyond. Clara stood beside Eli, baby James in her arms, watching the grieving widow Margaret try to hold herself together for her children. When the service ended, Clara approached her without hesitation. "Mrs. Henley," she said softly, "you won't face this alone. Not here." Margaret tried to be polite, tried to decline, but the truth spilled out between trembling hands. "I don't even know where to start," she whispered. "Robert handled everything: money, livestock, the homestead. I can't even read his ledgers." "Then you'll stay with us," Clara said simply, "until you find your feet again." Eli, overhearing, nodded. Robert was a good man. He'd have done the same for me. 3 days later, the Henleys arrived at Iron Creek, the big ranch house, once echoing with quiet, suddenly pulsed with live children's laughter, the slam of doors, and muddy boots scattered by the hearth. 10-year-old Ruth, wide-eyed and solemn, attached herself to Clara almost instantly, rocking baby James when Clara needed rest. By the end of the first week, Margaret had already reorganized the pantry and mended 2 sets of curtains. "You've given us a home," she said one evening as they prepared supper side by side. Clara smiled over the simmering stew. "Family doesn't keep accounts. Margaret, we build what we can together." For the first time in months, laughter returned to Margaret's face. Summer on the Dakota frontier brought more than just sunshine. It brought change. News spread that the railroad planned a spur line to connect Redstone to Miller's Creek, just a day's ride west. Land prices rose overnight. Speculators swarmed in from back east. Eli spent long evenings bent over a map, tracing rivers and boundaries by lamplight. "The old Henderson place is going up for auction next month," he said one night, tapping the parchment. "It's good land-water access, pasture enough for double the herd." Clara hesitated. "Can we afford it? With what we made on the cattle drive and what my sister Ann sent from Father's estate? Yes, it's time we expand." She caught the irony immediately. The Henderson ranch, the very ground where she had once been left humiliated and alone, was now within their reach. "There's justice in that," she said quietly. Eli reached for her hand. "Maybe this time, that land can stand for something good." The auction took place on a blistering August afternoon. The sun hammered down on Redstone's main square as ranchers and businessmen crowded beneath the awning of the courthouse. Clara stood beside Eli, her hat shading her eyes as the auctioneer called for bids. Several investors from St. Louis tried to outbid the locals, but the valley had its own kind of loyalty. When Eli raised his hand, the other ranchers lowered theirs. No one would challenge a man who had earned their respect through storm, fire, and flood. When the hammer finally fell, Iron Creek Ranch had doubled in size. Eli turned to Clara, a rare, quiet smile tugging at his mouth. "It's ours. It was always meant to be," she said. They rode out the next day to see the new property, bringing baby James and the Henley children along. The old Henderson house still stood a large, weather-beaten structure with peeling paint, but a sturdy frame. Weeds grew tall around the porch, and the wind moaned softly through broken shutters. Eli stepped inside first, testing the floorboards. "Sound foundation," he said. "We could fix it up, rent it to a new family. Maybe." Clara looked around at the empty rooms, her mind already alive with possibility. "Or," she said slowly, "we could turn it into something better." He raised an eyebrow, such as a school, not just lessons in the church basement, but a real schoolhouse. The town's growing. Eli, the children deserve more. Eli studied her for a long moment, pride flickering in his eyes. "You want to build a school on the very spot where he left you stranded. I want to build something that outlives the ugliness," she said simply. "Turn what was broken into something that serves others." He nodded. "Then we'll make it happen." The idea spread through Redstone like wildfire. Within weeks, donations poured in lumber from the sawmill, nails and glass from the general store, books from a Denver benefactor who'd read about the Dawson family's story in the Territorial Gazette. Jim Miller organized the work crew. Mary Dobson kept the men fed. Even Sarah Watson, now married to a banker in the capital, sent money for desks and slates. Catherine Parker Wells. once the frightened girl who'd arrived on a train with no place to go, was chosen as the school's first teacher. She and her husband, Deputy Marcus Wells, moved into the newly renovated upper rooms, while the lower floor became 2 bright classrooms with wide windows and clean pine floors. When Reverend Samuel Mills rang the bell for the first time that September morning, 23 children filed inside, their laughter spilling across the yard. Clara stood with Eli at the edge of the crowd, watching the moment unfold the valley's future beginning inside walls that had once held only bitterness. From an abandoned bride to a benefactor of Redstone, Mary Dobson murmured, her eyes shining, "You've come a long way, Clara Dawson." Clara smiled. Every journey starts with a single hard step, even the ones we never planned to take. That autumn brought another quiet miracle. Clara had known the signs the moment they began the queasiness, the bone-deep fatigue, the strange brightness of her dreams. When she told Eli, his joy was fierce but tempered by worry. Her first pregnancy had been kind, but every birth carried risk. "You need rest," he said, hovering as always. "I need fresh air and work," she countered. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Not my woman," he said with mock sternness, earning a laugh that eased the tension between them. Margaret Henley, who had delivered her own baby, a tiny girl she named Hope, became Clara's steadfast helper. Together they managed the house, the children, and the endless rhythm of ranch life. On cool evenings, when the air smelled of wood smoke and apple peel, the 2 women would sit by the fire, mending clothes and talking quietly while the babies slept. "You turned this ranch into something sacred," Margaret said one night, "a place where people begin again." Clara looked into the fire, her hand resting on her swelling belly. Maybe that's what Iron Creek was always meant to be, a place for second chances. Eli appeared in the doorway then, wiping his hands on a rag, "and a place for family," he added, as the firelight flickered over their faces, Clara's calm, Margaret's content, Eli's strong and steady. The sounds of children's laughter drifted from the next room. Outside, the wind moved softly through the cottonwoods, whispering across the land they had fought to make their own. For the first time since coming west, Clara realized she wasn't surviving anymore. She was living rooted, loved, and ready for whatever seasons lay ahead. By the time winter settled across the Dakota frontier, Iron Creek Ranch had become more than a homestead, it was a refuge. Inside its timber walls, 2 families worked as one. Clara Whitfield Dawson and Margaret Henley shared every burden, every triumph, their friendship forged in labor and late-night laughter. Snow came early that year, heavy and relentless. By December, the roads were impassable. Even the trail to Redstone vanished beneath drifts. Eli kept the fires high and the animals sheltered, while Clara and Margaret rationed supplies, sewing by lamplight as wind howled outside. Then, one night, the storm rose like a living thing and Clara felt the first sharp pain. It was a month too soon. Eli's face went pale. The path to town was buried, and Dr. Collins couldn't possibly reach them. For a moment, panic flashed in his eyes, but Margaret stepped forward with a calm born of experience. "I've birthed 3 on my own when the doctor couldn't come," she said. "We can do this. Clara." The labor stretched through the night, fierce and unending. Eli paced the next room, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since boyhood, while the Henley children kept little James distracted with stories beside the hearth. At last, as dawn broke over a world blanketed in white, a thin cry pierced the quiet. "She's small," Margaret said softly, laying the newborn in Clara's trembling arms, "but she's strong." Eli stepped in, his hands shaking as he looked down at the tiny face. "She's perfect," he whispered. Clara smiled through exhaustion. "Her name is Grace," she said, "for what carried us through." Spring melted the snow, and with it came the sound of new beginnings. Baby Grace grew quickly bright-eyed, curious, unstoppable. Before long, she was sitting up, reaching for everything within sight, while James tried in vain to keep her from tipping over baskets or chewing on his wooden horses. "She's going to be a handful," Eli said, watching the chaos. "She's going to be magnificent," Clara replied, laughing. That same spring, the railroad finally reached Redstone. Steam whistles echoed across the valley as the crews drove the final spikes. Within weeks, the once sleepy town burst alive new storefronts, a hotel, a newspaper, even a small bank. Prices soared, and so did temptation. One evening, Eli spread a stack of letters across the kitchen table, offers from investors, ranchers, and speculators. "They're offering enough to set us up anywhere," he said. "We could move east, live easy for the rest of our days." Clara looked around the room, Margaret rocking her baby Hope, the Henley children bent over schoolwork, James playing at her feet while Grace babbled from her cradle. The air smelled of stew and wood smoke, the sound of family filling every corner. "This is home," she said simply, "and home isn't for sale." Eli's answering smile was quiet, full of pride. "Then we stay." But progress didn't come without a price. By midsummer, the valley buzzed with strangers, men in fine coats with hungry eyes, surveyors with clipboards, and drifters following opportunity's scent. With them came trouble. Fences were slashed, cattle vanished. Neighbors muttered about disputes over water and grazing rights that sometimes ended in gunfire. The worst day arrived under a sky of blinding heat. Clara was in the garden with the children when a cloud of dust rose from the road. 6 riders appeared, led by a tall man in a tailored coat and city boots that had never seen mud. He dismounted smoothly, tipping his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Dawson, I presume, Jacob Sterling." Clara straightened. "What do you want? I represent a consortium of Eastern investors," he said. "We'd like to purchase your ranch. Fine property, prime location. It's not for sale." Sterling's tone turned oily. "Everything has a price. You should discuss it with your husband. Business decisions can be complicated for a lady." Clara's jaw tightened. "I understand perfectly well. Now get off our land." He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, then swung back onto his horse. "The valley's changing. Mrs. Dawson. Those who don't change with it tend to get buried by it." Dust rose behind him as the riders left, but his words hung heavy in the air. When Eli returned and heard what happened, the calm drained from his face. He rode straight to Redstone, demanding answers from Sheriff Dixon. The sheriff frowned, rubbing his beard. "Sterling's been buying up half the county. Some sold willing, others after their barns burned or their wells went bad. Hard to prove anything, but the pattern's there. He won't push us," Eli said grimly. The pressure came anyway. One week, 3 cattle turned up shot along the creek. Another, someone poured lye into the water troughs. Only Eli's vigilance kept the herd safe. Then, one black night, The smell of smoke jolted them awake. The barn was burning. Eli and Jim Miller led the bucket line while neighbors from miles around rode in to help. Snowmelt water hissed against the flames, steam rising into the cold air. By dawn, the fire was out, half the roof gone, but every animal saved. As the first light touched the smoldering timbers, Jim turned to Eli, his face streaked with soot. "This has gone too far. Sterling's behind it, sure as sunrise." The valley answered in unity. The ranchers met the next day at the church in Redstone, forming the Iron Creek Association, a pact to protect one another. They posted night patrols, shared supplies, and hired guards to ride the ridge roads. Word spread fast. The frontier families would not be bullied. Sheriff Dixon wired the territorial governor, and within weeks a pair of federal marshals arrived from Yankton to investigate. They dug deep, following the paper trail Sterling had left behind. What they uncovered reached far beyond the Dakota hills, a web of fraud, extortion, and land theft stretching across 3 territories. The marshals arrested Sterling and several of his men. Though he escaped conviction on legal technicalities, the damage was done. His reputation shattered. His investors withdrew, and the Grand Dakota Development Consortium collapsed overnight. When Sheriff Dixon stopped by Iron Creek to deliver the news, Eli listened in silence, arms crossed. "He's heading east with his tail between his legs," the sheriff said. "Looks like it's finally over." Eli exhaled slowly, glancing toward the fields where his herd grazed under the evening sun. "Maybe. But this valley won't ever be the same." Clara joined him on the porch, baby Grace in her arms, James chasing fireflies across the yard. Beyond them, Margaret rocked Hope while the Henley children played tag near the corral. "The world keeps changing," Clara said quietly. "All we can do is hold on to what's worth keeping." Eli slipped his arm around her shoulders. "Then we'll keep this our home, our people, our peace." For a while they stood together, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the hush that followed, the sound of the creek drifted through the still air, steady, unbroken, reminding them that even in a world of progress and peril, some things endured. And on that patch of land called Iron Creek Ranch, they vowed those things never would be sold. The autumn wind swept through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of earth and wood smoke. On the wide porch of Iron Creek Ranch, Clara Whitfield Dawson sat beside Eli as twilight deepened. Their children tumbled in the yard, James toddling after the Henley boys, little Grace crawling with fierce determination, her laughter mingling with theirs. Margaret Henley joined them, a folded letter in her hand, her expression both wistful and uncertain. "It's from my sister in California," she said softly. "She's widowed, too. She wants us to come live with her. Says there's room enough for all of us." Clara's heart sank. "You're thinking of leaving?" "I don't want to," Margaret admitted, her eyes shining. "You've become my family, but I can't keep living off your kindness. You've done enough." Eli leaned forward, his voice firm. "You're not imposing. You're family. This is your home as long as you need it." Margaret smiled sadly. "That's kind, but you deserve your space, your own life. And I think Robert would want me to start standing on my own again." Clara hesitated. Then a thought sparked. "What if you didn't have to leave? What if we built you a house right here close enough for the children to run between, far enough for privacy?" Eli's face lit with understanding. "The old Henderson site. We cleared most of it when we built the school. There's plenty of land for another house." Margaret blinked, torn between disbelief and hope. "You'd really do that?" Clara reached across, taking her hand. Family takes care of family. That fall, the men of the valley came together to build. It wasn't grand, just a sturdy clapboard house with a small porch and windows that caught the morning sun, but it was warm, solid, and entirely hers. The children watched every nail driven, running messages and hauling wood scraps like seasoned carpenters. By the time the first frost settled over the fields, Margaret and her little ones had moved in. From the main house, Clara could see the lamplight glow through her friends' windows each evening. A second heartbeat pulsing across the snow. It felt right. As November deepened, preparations began for their third Thanksgiving at Iron Creek Ranch. Clara's kitchen bustled from dawn till dark, pies cooling by the window, roasted squash filling the air with sweet spice, 2 turkeys browning side by side. The table would be full this year. Margaret and her children, the Millers, Dr. Collins, Catherine and Marcus Wells, even Sarah and Bob Watson making the long trip from the capital. Eli appeared behind Clara, wrapping his arms around her as she stirred gravy on the stove. "Remember the first night you stood at Henderson's gate," he murmured. "You had nowhere to go, and I offered one night's shelter." Clara leaned back into him, smiling. "Best offer you ever made." In the next room, James tore after one of the barn cats while Grace crawled in determined pursuit, squealing with delight. Margaret sat by the fire, nursing her baby Hope, humming softly, while the Henley children argued cheerfully about who would set the table. "We built something good here," Clara said, watching them. Eli's gaze followed hers. "No, we built something real from the hardest beginnings." Outside, the first snow began to fall soft, silent, and endless, wrapping the world in white. Inside, the house glowed with warmth and laughter. Then came the knock. Eli opened the door, and the winter wind rushed in, carrying with it a young woman barely past 20. Her coat was soaked, her face pinched from cold. In one gloved hand she clutched a crumpled paper. Beside her rested a battered trunk. "Please," she stammered, "I'm looking for the Baxter Ranch. I'm supposed to marry John Baxter, but I can't find Clara." And Eli exchanged a glance. John Baxter had died 2 years earlier in a riding accident. "Come in," Clara said at once, guiding the trembling woman toward the fire. "Get warm. We'll sort it out in the morning." The stranger sank into a chair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "What's your name?" dear Clara asked gently. "Alice," she whispered. "Alice Thornton." Eli brought her trunk inside while Margaret fetched blankets and tea. The children clustered near, wide-eyed but kind, their natural curiosity softened by compassion. Through the flicker of firelight, Clara saw herself years ago frightened, alone, standing at that same threshold with nowhere to turn. She caught Eli's eye. He was smiling. That same rare, full smile that had changed her life the night he'd first opened his door. Another soul, another gate, another chance to turn abandonment into belonging. "You're safe now," Clara said, pressing a warm cup into Alice's shaking hands. "Whatever's ahead, you're not alone anymore." By morning, the storm had passed. The ranch yard glittered beneath the pale sun, a world of glass and silver. Inside, the long table was crowded again, 2 turkeys, fresh bread, steaming vegetables, and a dozen laughing voices. Alice sat near the fire, color back in her cheeks. Baby Grace curled in her lap. James stood proudly beside her, explaining which horse in his wooden herd was fastest. The Henley children, without being asked, had set another place at the table. Clara caught Eli watching the scene, quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "We've come a long way from that gate," he said softly. She shook her head, smiling. "Not far at all. We just built farther around it, outside." Smoke rose from Margaret's chimney. Beyond that, the school stood bright against the snow, its bell waiting to call children again come Monday. Further still, the town of Redstone shimmered on the horizon, bigger now, busier, yet bound together by the same spirit that had carried them through every hardship. Clara looked around the room at the faces she loved: Eli, Margaret, their children, the friends who had become kin, and felt something deeper than happiness settle in her chest. It was peace, the kind born of hard work, forgiveness, and faith in ordinary goodness. Alice looked up from her tea, eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you for taking me in, for everything." Clara smiled, her voice warm but certain. "That's what we do here. We take care of one another." The fire crackled. Laughter spilled from the kitchen. Snow fell softly beyond the windows, blanketing the Dakota hills in quiet grace. Iron Creek Ranch stood strong against the winter night, no longer just a home, but a beacon, a place where strangers found shelter, where wounds became stories, and where every closed door could open again. And as the first stars appeared above the frozen fields, Clara Dawson whispered a simple truth that had shaped her life from the moment she'd stepped off that train. "Sometimes," she said, half to herself, "the road we never meant to take leads exactly where we're meant to be." The scent of fresh bread drifted through Iron Creek Ranch. Mingling with pine from the hearth and the faint sweetness of lavender, Clara Whitfield Dawson kept tucked into every corner. It was the smell of home, of safety and belonging, the kind she'd never known until she built it here with her own hands. Tomorrow would bring its share of burdens. There were fences to mend, calves to brand, lessons to prepare at the school. Alice Thornton still needed guidance, her future uncertain but unfolding. The town of Redstone would keep expanding, for better and worse new faces, new fortunes, new dangers. But tonight, the house was full of laughter and lamplight. Eli sat beside her on the porch, his calloused hand resting over hers as the children tumbled through the yard. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Clara looked at him, the man who'd once offered her one night's shelter and ended up offering her an entire life. She smiled. "Not a single one." Over the next days, Alice's story came clear. John Baxter had indeed written for a bride, but a broken horse had ended his life 6 weeks before she arrived. His brother, Samuel, had inherited the property and wanted nothing to do with the arrangement. He'd sold nearly everything to a group of speculators tied to Sterling's old partners, now operating under a different name. Alice sat at the kitchen table while Grace played at her feet, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she barely touched. "I have nowhere to go," she said quietly. "No family left back east, no money, no home." "You have us," Clara said, "and that's not nothing." Eli returned that evening from Redstone, dust thick on his coat and worry in his voice. "It's true," he said grimly. "Sterling's men are buying up land again, smaller parcels this time, hiding behind new company names. They're circling like buzzards waiting for weakness." Margaret, who'd come for supper, frowned. "And what about Alice? She can't travel in her condition." Clara already had an answer. Catherine mentioned needing help at the school. Enrollments doubled since the railroad came through. Alice taught before, back in Illinois. She could assist, live in the small room behind the school until she figures things out. Eli rubbed his chin. That's a start, but it's temporary. All beginnings are temporary. Clara replied. Ours was. When they told Alice the next morning, she wept openly. You'd do that for me. You don't even know me. Clara smiled gently. We know enough. You came all this way for a chance at a better life. That's bravery enough to earn one. Within a week, Alice moved into the small quarters behind the schoolhouse. Catherine Wells welcomed her with open arms, grateful for the help. With Alice teaching the younger children, Catherine could focus on the older ones. The school's bell rang brighter that autumn, 2 voices leading the lessons, 2 lives rebuilt through purpose. By mid-October, prosperity had returned to the valley. The cattle fetched high prices at market. The harvest was strong, and Iron Creek's new acreage thrived. Yet Clara sensed a quiet restlessness in Eli. She'd find him late at night, bent over the kitchen table. Maps and territorial surveys spread before him, the lamplight catching the furrow between his brows. What's weighing on you? She asked one evening after the children were asleep. The valley's changing, he said. Not just more people, but what kind of people? Investors from the east think they can buy up every hill and hollow, divide it into plots, sell it to settlers who've never seen a steer. They'll bleed the land dry and move on. So we stop them. He looked at her, tired but admiring, how they've got money, lawyers, friends in high offices. Clara thought for a long moment. They have power, she said finally, but not community. We built this place from nothing. We know every creek bend, every storm that's torn through here. If we stand together, they can't break us apart. We need something formal, a town government, real laws, a voice. Eli frowned thoughtfully. You mean to incorporate Redstone exactly. If we're organized, we set our own rules instead of letting outsiders write them for us. The idea spread faster than Clara expected. By November, word had reached every ranch and farm from the foothills to the northern flats. The meeting was held in the schoolhouse on a cold evening, lanterns hanging from rafters, the air thick with anticipation. Every bench was full. Men and women stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, ranchers, farmers, miners, even shopkeepers. Sheriff Dixon, Reverend Mills, and Dr. Collins sat up front, listening as Clara rose to speak. Friends, she began, steady and clear. We built this valley with our hands, our sweat, and our prayers, but if we want it to last, we need to protect it properly. That means organization. That means government. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone muttered, sounds like taxes. Clara nodded. Small ones, enough to build roads, keep lawmen paid, maybe even fund a hospital one day. But more than that, it gives us legal standing. We'll be able to write ordinances about land use, water rights, fair trade. Outsiders won't push us around anymore. Jim Miller stood up, his voice booming. Emma's, he caught himself, smiling toward Clara. Clara's right. If we don't organize ourselves, someone else will. I say we make it official. The crowd buzzed in agreement. Sheriff Dixon raised his hat. Time to give this valley a proper name. Time to make Redstone a real town. Then we'll need leadership. Miller continued, and I can't think of a man better suited than Eli Dawson. Eli's eyes widened. Now hold on. But the voices swelled around him, seconded, thirded, unanimous. When the vote was taken, Every hand went up. Clara met his astonished look with quiet pride. "Looks like you've been elected, Mr. Mayor." Laughter rolled through the room, warm and relieved. After years of struggle, the people of Redstone had found their footing not as scattered settlers, but as a community bound by trust. That night, as the last lanterns dimmed and families drifted home through the snow, Clara and Eli lingered on the school steps. The valley stretched below them, silver under the moon, dotted with lights from homesteads that had once stood isolated and uncertain. Eli let out a slow breath. "I never asked for this." "I know," Clara said, slipping her hand into his, "but you earned it." He turned toward her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "So did you." They stood there a while longer, the cold forgotten, listening to the sound of wind moving through the pines. Beyond the ridge, the faint whistle of the midnight train drifted across the valley progress, unstoppable and loud. But here, at the heart of it all, Iron Creek Ranch stood steady. The next morning, the sun rose clear over Redstone. The town had a mayor, a charter, and a future shaped by the very people who had once arrived with nothing. And as Clara watched her children chase the first snowflakes of the season, she thought of the words she'd spoken long ago sometimes. "The road we never meant to take leads exactly where we're meant to be." For the first time, it felt not just true for her, but for the whole valley. Clara Whitfield Dawson studied her husband's face as the applause faded through the schoolhouse. He stood there stiffly, hat in hand, his jaw tight with reluctant acceptance. Eli had never wanted to be a leader, but the people of Redstone had chosen him anyway. By the first week of November, the incorporation papers were signed, and the frontier settlement of Redstone was officially on the map. Eli threw himself into his new duties as mayor with the same tireless resolve he brought to ranching, writing ordinances by lamplight, meeting with settlers, arguing for fairness between old hands and newcomers alike. He still rode fence lines at dawn, but his evenings now belonged to the town. It was during those early weeks of Redstone's founding that an unexpected letter arrived for Clara. The envelope bore a Philadelphia postmark, the name of a law firm she had not seen since her father's death. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. "Your father's former partner, Harold Westbrook, passed away." The letter began. "In the course of settling his estate, we discovered documentation proving he owed your father a sum of $50,000, unpaid due to fraudulent bookkeeping. The court has ruled in your favor. As his sole heir, these funds are yours." Clara's knees gave way. She sank into a chair. $50,000, a fortune beyond imagination, enough to retire, to travel, to buy every acre from Redstone to the horizon. Eli found her an hour later, still staring at the letter on the table. He read it, gave a low whistle, and sat beside her. "This changes things," he murmured. "Does it?" Clara asked quietly. "We have all we need. Home, family, purpose. What more could money give us?" Eli leaned back, thinking. Maybe not for us, but for the valley it could mean progress. The hospital you always wanted, better tools for the school, a library, even. Clara looked at him with a mix of love and awe. Another man might have seen opportunity for comfort. Eli saw a chance for service. "Then we'll use it," she said, but carefully. Money can build or destroy, depending on the hands that hold it. They told no one about the windfall. Quietly, change began to ripple outward. The school gained new desks and books shipped from Chicago. Dr. Collins received equipment for a small but proper clinic. Reverend Mills found anonymous donations arriving for families in need. When asked where it came from, he only smiled and said, "From God's better angels." Winter came early, fierce and unyielding. By December, snow lay thick across the valley, roads vanished beneath white silence, and ranches stood isolated for weeks. It was during one of these storms that Alice Thornton went into labor. The wind screamed around the schoolhouse, snow sealing the doors shut. There was no reaching Dr. Collins. Catherine Wells sent her husband Marcus for help, but he returned empty-handed. The path to town was buried, so Clara and Margaret took charge. Between them, they'd seen enough births to know what to do, but this one was hard from the start. The baby was turned wrong. Alice gripped the blanket, her face pale with exhaustion, every contraction wringing a cry from her lips. "You're doing fine," Clara said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. Margaret caught her eye, worry etched deep. "The baby needs turning." "I read how once," Clara whispered, "but never done it. I saw a midwife do it," Margaret said. "I can try." Between the two women, moving with infinite care, they turned the child within the womb. Hours passed. Then, at last, as dawn broke through a thinning storm, a thin wail filled the room. "He's perfect," Clara whispered, placing the tiny boy in Alice's trembling arms. Tears cut clean paths through Alice's sweat-streaked face. "I'll name him John," she said softly, "for the man who brought me west, even if he never knew." The storm outside eased to quiet snow. Inside, the fire burned warm, and another life began. Caring for a newborn while teaching proved impossible. So Alice returned temporarily to Iron Creek Ranch. The Dawson house, already bustling, became a small universe of noise and love. James, now 4, had declared himself protector of all the younger children. Grace, at 2, was a streak of energy, determined to match her brother's every move. Margaret's baby Hope toddled unsteadily after them, and Alice's infant added his cries to the lively chorus. Eli took in the scene one evening, 5 children, 2 mothers, a household alive with laughter and chaos, and shook his head. "We need a bigger house, or another one," Clara said, "for Alice and John, near Margaret's place, close enough to stay connected." Eli smiled. A family circle, our own little town within the town. By spring, the idea had taken shape. A modest cottage rose on the far side of the yard, forming a triangle with the Dawsons' home and Margaret's. Between them stretched shared gardens and a common yard where children could play under the cottonwoods. It was more than shelter, it was community. Soon, word spread across the frontier. Widows, single mothers, and women abandoned on the journey west began arriving in Redstone, drawn by whispers of a ranch that welcomed the lost and gave them purpose. Some stayed to work. Others found their footing and moved on, but all carried the same story that there was a place in Dakota where no one was left behind. The Reverend called it the miracle at Iron Creek. "You're building something rare," he told Clara after Sunday service one spring morning. "A community that proves blood isn't the only bond that makes a family." Clara smiled modestly. "We're just doing what needs doing." But deep down, she understood. This was what she and Eli had been creating all along, something larger than themselves. A living testament that kindness could build more than walls and fences. It could build legacy. That summer brought joy and loss in equal measure. Sarah Watson returned for a visit, twin daughters in tow, her laughter bright as sunlight after years apart. The reunion was tender, old wounds long healed. Together, the women walked the ranch fields that once felt endless and empty. "You were right," Sarah said, her eyes sweeping over the 3 houses, the children playing in the yard, the distant school bell ringing through the valley. "You turned sorrow into a kingdom." Clara shook her head. "Not a kingdom, a home." As evening fell, the sky burned gold above Redstone, and smoke curled from the chimneys of Iron Creek Ranch, the home that had started as a refuge and grown into a promise. Clara looked around at the laughter, the noise, the boundless life she had once thought forever beyond her reach. In that moment, she knew the true measure of riches wasn't written in ledgers or court rulings. It lived here in the warmth of shared walls, the echo of children's laughter, and the simple grace of people who refused to let anyone stand alone at the gate. And as the first stars appeared, she felt her father's fortune resting quietly not in the bank, but in the light spilling from every window at Iron Creek Ranch. "You were right to turn my brother down that day in the store." Sarah Watson told Clara as they watched their children tumble through the grass, laughter echoing in the crisp mountain air. "You had bigger things waiting for you." Clara smiled faintly. There had been pain and doubt, but looking now at her family, her friends, the thriving town below, she knew Sarah was right. News from the east arrived that same week Tom Henderson was dead, killed in a prison brawl. Clara felt no triumph, only a quiet, sorrowful release. "He brought it on himself," Eli said, but she heard the regret behind his words. They had both hoped, foolishly perhaps, that even a man like Henderson might find redemption. That door was now closed forever. The following months brought rapid change to Redston. The railroad opened its full line that spring, and the quiet valley that once seemed a world apart found itself at the crossroads of progress. Trains rolled in weekly, carrying families, dreamers, merchants, and those seeking something less honest. As mayor, Eli Dawson spent long days at the council hall, striving to balance opportunity with preservation. Some changes were necessary: new roads, a proper post office, irrigation channels, but others threatened the very character of the valley. The most divisive came from a group of Eastern investors who proposed building a grand hotel and casino near the river, promising jobs and wealth. Half the town hailed it as progress. The other half, led by Clara, saw it as a wedge that would splinter Redstone's moral spine. She gathered the women of the town, teachers, mothers, ranchers' wives, and widows, and together they formed a petition. They spoke at every meeting, wrote letters, stood their ground. The debate grew heated, neighbors divided, tempers flaring in the saloon and church alike. The final vote came at a packed town meeting in early summer. Clara rose to speak, her voice calm but carrying through the hall. "We came here seeking something better," she said. "Some came for land, some for gold, some for a new beginning. I came here with nothing but hope, and what I found was a community. We built this place with our hands and our hearts. A casino might bring money, but it would cost us something we can't buy back: our decency, our children's innocence, the soul of this valley." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "We've already proved that prosperity isn't just counted in coin. It's counted in how we care for one another. Sometimes the richest towns are the ones that know what not to sell." The hall went silent. When the votes were counted, the casino was rejected by a narrow margin. The investors left furious, muttering that Redstone would regret it. But that night, the townsfolk gathered in the square, fiddles singing into the warm air, children dancing beneath strings of lanterns. Eli took Clara's hand as they danced. "You did that," he said. "We did," she corrected, smiling up at him. "All of us together." Autumn came soft and golden, the fields heavy with grain. That was when Clara discovered she was expecting again. At 32, she was older than most women on the frontier to bear another child. Eli worried aloud, pacing the porch while she folded laundry in the fading light. "We have enough," he said. "Between ours and everyone else's, the house barely holds us." Clara laid a hand over her stomach. "Hearts expand," she said. "There's always room for one more." This pregnancy was harder. Fatigue shadowed her days, and her back ached constantly. By late November, Dr. Collins ordered bed rest. It frustrated her deeply to lie idle while the world around her moved, but her circle of women filled every gap. Margaret managed the household. Alice watched the children. Catherine brought school lessons for James, and even Sarah made the long trip from the capital to lend her hands. One afternoon, as the women worked around Clara's bed mending clothes, stirring preserves, laughter mingling with the scent of cinnamon, Sarah looked up. "Who would have imagined, back in that dry goods store, that we'd end up like this family chooses you?" Margaret said, smiling. "If you're lucky." Clara's throat tightened. She had never felt luckier. The first snow arrived early that winter, swirling across the plains in a white haze. 2 weeks before her due date, Clara went into labor. The storm outside raged for 2 days, cutting them off from town. When at last her cries gave way to a sharp, triumphant wail, Eli caught his breath. "A girl," Margaret whispered, placing the tiny bundle into Clara's arms. "Faith," Clara said softly, "for the grace that's carried us this far." Eli held their newborn daughter with reverence. "3 children," he murmured. "When I first built this ranch, I never imagined it filled with this much life." "Life never goes as imagined," Clara said with a tired smile. "It goes better." The winter that followed would be remembered across the valley as one of the hardest in memory. Blizzard after blizzard swept through, burying fences, collapsing barns, freezing livestock. Roads disappeared entirely, isolating families for weeks. Eli organized rescue parties, riding out through waist-deep snow to deliver supplies or bring neighbors back to safety. From her bed, Clara coordinated the town's relief efforts, sending food, blankets, and fuel where it was needed most. The schoolhouse became a shelter, its stoves burning day and night. Then, amid the worst storm of all, came a miracle. A train had been trapped between snowdrifts, blocked both ahead and behind. Among its passengers was a physician from Chicago bound for California, a young woman named Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, one of the few trained female surgeons in the country. Dr. Collins was overwhelmed with pneumonia cases and injuries he could not treat. Dr. Garrett stepped forward without hesitation. For 2 weeks, she performed surgeries by lantern light, saving 6 lives, including Jim Dobson's youngest boy who had fallen gravely ill. When the tracks were finally cleared, the passengers prepared to continue west. But Dr. Garrett made an announcement that stunned the entire town. "I'm staying," she said simply. This valley needs a proper hospital, and I need a place where I don't have to fight to prove I belong." Clara and Eli exchanged a long look. They both knew what must come next. "We might be able to help with that," Clara said quietly. That spring, on land donated by the town and with funds secretly drawn from Clara's Philadelphia inheritance, Redstone's first hospital was built a small but modern structure, complete with running water and surgical rooms. Dr. Garrett directed it with quiet authority, aided by Dr. Collins. Within months, the hospital was serving the entire Dakota frontier. As Faith grew from infant to lively crawler, as James started school and Grace shadowed her father in the fields, Clara often stood on the porch of Iron Creek Ranch, watching the valley stretch wide and golden before her. The ranch had grown to 2,000 acres. Redstone had tripled in size. The school now held 3 teachers, and Eli, in his second term as mayor, was drafting plans for a library. Sometimes, when the evening wind drifted through the cottonwoods, Clara thought of the girl she'd once been, the one left at a stranger's gate, with nothing but a suitcase and trembling hope. That girl could never have imagined this a home that rang with laughter, a town that bore her mark, and a legacy built not from wealth or luck, but from kindness, courage, and faith. And as the lamps flickered to life across the valley, she whispered a quiet promise to the night. "We'll keep the gate open for every soul who needs to find their way home." The hospital had changed everything. People came from every corner of the valley, farmers, ranchers, travelers along the new rail line, and Redstone became a place known not just for its harvests or cattle, but for compassion. By late summer, clusters of homesteads had formed around Iron Creek Ranch widows, single mothers, abandoned families building small lives of their own, united by shared work and shared hope. From the porch, Clara often watched them tending gardens, mending roofs, and laughing in the evenings. They had created something no blueprint could plan, a living testament that kindness could build a town. One golden evening, as the sun sank behind the black hills and the air smelled faintly of sage and rain, Eli sat beside her on the porch rail. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It's time I stepped down as mayor." Clara turned toward him, startled. "Why would you do that? You've built so much." "Because it's built now," he said simply. "There are younger men, ready to lead men who grew up in the order we fought to make. It's time I come home for a while. I want to teach James to ride properly. I want to be here when Grace goes to her first dance. I want to watch Faith take her first steps instead of hearing about it secondhand." Clara smiled softly, emotion rising in her chest. "That sounds perfect." They sat in silence for a while, watching dusk fall across the valley. In the yard below, the children, dozens of them, not only their own, chased fireflies, their laughter rising like birdsong into the twilight. Margaret and Alice sat on the porch of Alice's little house, keeping watch, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Smoke curled from chimneys across the compound, carrying the scent of bread, stew, and roasted corn. "We did something extraordinary, didn't we?" Clara said finally. "From the worst beginning." Eli squeezed her hand. "You did something extraordinary. You took abandonment and turned it into belonging. You took strangers and made them family." She shook her head. "I was the stranger. You're the one who took me in." Before he could answer, James ran up to them, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mama, Papa, we caught 12 fireflies. Grace says we should let them go so they can make more, but I think we should keep them in a jar." Clara smiled. "What do you think is the right thing to do?" James frowned, considering seriously. "Let them go," he decided, "so there'll be fireflies for Faith when she's big enough to chase them." Eli ruffled his son's hair. "That's a fine answer." They watched as James sprinted back to the other children, unscrewing the lid of the jar, 100 tiny lights rising into the night. "He's learning what matters," Clara whispered. Eli nodded. "They all are." Later, after the children were tucked into bed, Clara lingered for a moment at the doorway. Across the yard, the windows of the other homes glowed warm against the dark, a circle of light carved out of wilderness. She thought of that first night years ago, standing alone at a gate she believed marked the end of her life. It had turned out to be the beginning. Inside, the house buzzed with the gentle chaos of family. James was whispering to Grace down the hall, conspiring some mischief for morning. Faith stirred in her cradle, sighing softly. From the barn came the steady creak of the windmill Eli had built his first winter here. It had powered everything that followed. When she finally entered their bedroom, Eli was sitting by the mirror polishing the frame he'd carved from oak. Clara caught her reflection and paused. The woman in the glass was not the same desperate girl who'd once stepped off a wagon with calloused hands and a single trunk to her name. Her skin bore the marks of sun and wind. Faint silver threaded her hair. Yet there was strength in her shoulders and peace in her eyes. Harold Westbrook had once mocked her for working like a field hand. He'd been right about the calluses, but wrong about everything else. Those roughened hands had built a world. Eli came up behind her, his reflection meeting hers in the mirror. "You're beautiful," he said softly. She smiled. "I'm weathered. You're seasoned," he corrected, "like good timber stronger for having faced the storms." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Henderson hadn't left me that day?" "Every day," Eli said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And every day I thank heaven he did. Otherwise, I might never have found you." Before she could reply, a small cry pierced the quiet. "Faith again," Clara murmured, reaching for her shawl. She crossed the hall to the nursery, where the baby wriggled in her cradle, cheeks flushed with hunger. Clara gathered her up, settling into the rocking chair Eli had built when she was expecting James. The rhythm of the chair, the weight of the child against her chest, filled her with a deep, anchoring calm. From down the hall came Eli's voice, low, steady, soothing Grace after a dream. The sound of him, the security in it, made her heart ache with gratitude. This was her life, not the one she had planned, but the one she had built. Choice by choice, day by day, shaped from sorrow into something whole. Outside, the stars began to appear over the ridge, sharp and bright in the clear western sky. The windmill creaked softly, turning in the night breeze. Somewhere, a coyote called, distant and haunting, answered by another across the valley. Clara rocked her daughter, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Tomorrow there would be work to do, always more fences to mend, lessons to plan, and neighbors to help. The town would grow and change, bringing new souls to their gate. Some would come lost, as she once had. And when they did, the Dawsons would be there, as they always had been, to open the door. Much later, when the house was quiet and Faith slept again, Clara slipped back into bed beside Eli. He stirred, wrapping an arm around her. "Everything all right. Perfect," she whispered. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "We've come a long way, haven't we, all the way home?" she said, and as sleep folded over them, the first light of dawn began to gather beyond the hills, touching the roofs of Iron Creek Ranch and the valley beyond. It shone on 3 homes, on a hospital's whitewashed walls, on a schoolhouse bell that would ring in the morning, echoes of a life built from mercy and perseverance. In the heart of that light sat the woman who had once been left at a closed gate. Now she was its keeper, and under her watch it would never close again. That night, in the house she and Eli had raised from dust and hope, Clara knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The woman who once stood alone at a gate had become the cornerstone of something lasting, something good, something that would endure long after she and Eli were gone. Faith stirred softly in her arms. Her tiny face relaxed in sleep. Clara brushed a fingertip over her daughter's downy hair and smiled. When Faith grew up, she would never know what it meant to be utterly alone. She would never stand in the cold, waiting for a door that wouldn't open. She would grow surrounded by love and guided by example proof that families could be built from courage and kindness as much as blood. When the baby finally sighed and drifted into deeper sleep, Clara rose carefully and laid her in the cradle. She lingered for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall, the lamplight dancing over her small, perfect hands. 1,000 memories pressed at her heart the first time she saw Eli, the first harvest, the laughter of the women who had come broken and left whole again. Every piece of it had shaped her, refined her like iron and flame. She crossed quietly into the bedroom. Eli was there, propped against the headboard, reading by lamplight. He set the book aside as she entered, his expression softening. "All quiet?" he asked. "All quiet," she said, sliding into the bed beside him. The room was filled with the small, familiar noises of home, the creak of the old beams, the sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods, the faint hum of the windmill outside. The valley had its own music, and tonight it seemed to play just for them. After a long moment, Eli spoke. "I love you, Clara. I don't say it enough." She smiled against his shoulder. "You say it every day in the way you look at our children, in the way you work this land, in how you've opened your heart to others. Words are only part of it." He turned his head slightly, his voice low. "Still, you deserve to hear them." "Then hear mine," she said, looking up at him. "I love you too, Eli Dawson, for stopping at that gate, for offering shelter, for standing beside me through every season, for building this life with me." He kissed her forehead, the kind of kiss that carried years within it. "For as long as we have," he whispered. "For as long as we have," she echoed. They lay in quiet contentment, the warmth of the lamp fading into soft shadow. Outside, the moon climbed over the hills, casting pale light across the ranch, the barns, the schoolhouse roof gleaming faintly in the distance, and the cluster of homes that had sprung from compassion and persistence. As sleep began to overtake her, Clara's mind wandered back to that frightened girl who had once arrived in Redstone with nothing but a letter and a name. If she could speak to that girl now, she would tell her this: "The worst moments don't define you. What defines you is what you build from them. From abandonment can rise belonging. From loss can grow strength. From the end of one dream can come the beginning of another, truer and more beautiful than you ever dared to imagine." The world beyond Redstone would keep changing, railroads pushing west, cities rising, people coming and going, but this valley, this family, would remain. It was her proof that love could take root in the hardest ground and still flourish. The last thing Clara heard before sleep claimed her was the steady rhythm of Eli's breathing beside her and the house settling gently around them, the quiet pulse of a home that had outlived sorrow. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The story of Clara Whitfield and Eli Dawson reminds us that life's greatest blessings often arrive wrapped in hardship. When Clara was left abandoned on the frontier, she had every reason to give up. Instead, she chose to keep walking. And when Eli opened his door to a stranger, he discovered that love, like faith, grows strongest in the soil of compassion. For those of us who have lived long enough to see both joy and loss, their story is a gentle reminder. It is never too late to begin again. Whether we are 30 or 70, the power to rebuild remains in our hands. Family is not only who we are born to, but also who we choose to stand beside. Sometimes the world feels colder than it used to be, but a single act of kindness, a listening ear, a helping hand, an open door can still change the course of a life. Just as Eli and Clara turned abandonment into belonging, we, too, can turn loneliness into love. Because in the end, it isn't the storms that define us. It's how we choose to shelter others through them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time and heart. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the power of kindness, of faith, of second chances, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. Your support helps keep these stories of courage and compassion alive for generations to come. See you in the next story, where the frontier meets the human heart.